All ready? Ready to get rolling?
I'm ready when you are.
The subcommittee will come to order. Today, the subcommittee is meeting to consider H.R. 2221, the Data Accountability and Trust Act, H.R. 2309, the Consumer Credit and Debt Protection Act, H.R. 1706, the Protecting Consumer Access to Generic Drugs Act, and H.R. 2190, the Mercury Pollution Reduction Act. Pursuant to Rule 9, the chairman and ranking member will each have 5 minutes for opening statements, and any other committee member who wishes to make an opening statement will have 3 minutes. I now yield to myself for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. We're going to consider 4 bills today. This subcommittee has held legislative hearings on all 4 bills, and today's markup represents another step forward towards these bills eventually becoming law. At the outset, I want to emphasize that all 4 bills remain works in progress. I will be introducing the manager's amendment on 3 of the 4 bills, and I fully expect that all 4 bills will undergo further changes from subcommittee to full committee. While I cannot guarantee that we will all ultimately agree on the final legislative products, I can assure my friends on the other side of the aisle and all affected stakeholders that we will continue to work in a cooperative and deliberative manner. My intent is to produce legislation that is strong and adequately protects consumers, but at the same time is careful and thoughtful. The first bill we will be introducing today or considering today is H.R. 2221, the Data Accountability and Trust Act. This bill was originally introduced in the 109th Congress by then Subcommittee Chairman Stearns, and eventually passed the full committee by a unanimous vote. This bipartisan bill addresses the problem of data breaches and the harm those breaches impose on consumers. H.R. 2221 requires companies that hold data with personal information to develop reasonable security measures for that data and notification protocols in case of a breach. I will be introducing a bipartisan manager's amendment that makes several changes to the underlying bill. The second bill we will be considering today is H.R. 2309, the Consumer Credit and Debt Protection Act. I am the principal author of the bill, and the subcommittee has had numerous hearings on consumer credit matters this Congress. H.R. 2309 provides the Federal Trade Commission with much-needed standard rule-making authority under the Administrative Procedures Act in order to address consumer protection in the credit market. Currently, the Commission is burdened with rulemaking authority under the so-called Magnuson-Moss Act, which can take years to craft important rules. I will be introducing a manager's amendment to this bill as well. Thirdly, the subcommittee will take up H.R. 1706, the Protecting Consumer Access to Generic Drugs Act, which was introduced by Chairman Waxman and myself. H.R. 1706 prohibits the practice of so-called pay for delay in drug patent settlements, whereby the brand name drug companies pay the generic drug companies to stay off the market. During the time when we're deliberating on universal health care and ways to cut down costs, this bill will save taxpayers and consumers billions of dollars from increased generic competition in the marketplace. Lastly, the subcommittee will consider H.R. 2190, the Mercury Pollution Reduction Act, introduced by my friend, the vice chair of the subcommittee, Ms. Schakowsky. H.R. 2190 prohibits the use of mercury in the manufacturing of chlorine in the United States 2 years after enactment. The bill further prohibits the export of mercury from these plants effective immediately. There are only 4 facilities in the U.S. that still use mercury in the production of chlorine, and I believe this bill will move those plants toward production methods that are not only healthier for the environment and the public, but more efficient and cost-effective in the long run. I will have a manager's amendment for this bill as well. I want to thank all the subcommittee members and their staff for their hard work on all of these bills. We're going through regular order in order to provide all of the members of this subcommittee an ability to make their mark. As I stated earlier, this is only the beginning of the process, and I look forward to working with all of the members of this subcommittee, Democrats and Republicans alike, as we move forward to the full committee. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I recognize now the ranking member of the subcommittee for the purposes of opening statements, Mr. Radonovich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we will consider several bills, and I intend to support one of them, H.R. 2221, the Data Accountability and Trust Act. This legislation establishes 2 important requirements Congress recognized in 2005. First, it sets a federal standard for business to protect sensitive personal information, and second, requires notification to customers when their data has been breached. We will consider an amendment that you will offer, Mr. Chairman, that has been worked on in a bipartisan manner and makes changes based on comments we have received from stakeholders. I intend to support your amendment because it makes sensible improvements that are consistent with the goals of the legislation and will relieve duplicative requirements for businesses that have substantially similar requirements under existing federal law. Unfortunately, I will not be able to support the other 3 bills for a variety of reasons. For H.R. 2309, the Consumer Credit and Debt Protection Act, I commend you for your intent to ensure consumers are protected and that the bad actors are prosecuted when they deal in credit and debt issues. I support the directed rulemaking for debt settlement services and the Commission's examination of motor vehicle financing practices to determine whether the rules should be considered for what is often the second largest purchase for any individual or family. Were it only these 2 issues, you would have my full support, but the legislation also provides blanket new federal rulemaking authority under the Administrative Procedures Act rather than the congressionally mandated Magnuson-Moss procedures on any issue of consumer credit and debt. It is not clear how wide a net that will cast or what business practices will be captured. With the new rulemaking authority, civil penalties will apply to any violation of the new rule of the Commission issues for consumer credit or debt. But the legislation also provides the authority to levy civil penalties for any violation of a deceptive act or practice related to credit or debt without it being a violation of the rule. I believe this is unnecessary if the Commission will be promulgating new rules defining what are unfair and deceptive practices. Changing the standard will effectively require every business that extends credit to predict the future and guess what the Commission will determine is an unfair or deceptive practice or else be subject to a civil fine. I appreciate your willingness to look at our suggestion to bring transparency to the State Attorney General's enforcement provision when they use the private attorneys, but that was not accepted. In the interest of good government, I would like to see us continue to work together to make sure that the legal system is as open and transparent as possible whenever the federal government delegates enforcement authority to the states. Similarly, I have expressed my concerns with H.R. 1706, Protecting Consumers' Access to Generic Drugs Act, which bans patent litigation settlements between pharmaceutical companies involving exchanges of value. Congress enacted Hatch-Waxman as a way to facilitate generic entry into the market. And the resulting agreements now concern the FTC, who has challenged a number of these agreements in court. The FTC has prevailed in one court challenge but lost a number of others. I'm concerned that the proposed legislative solution will not benefit the consumers because of its likely fewer patents that will be challenged, and we'll be back here proposing another solution in a very short time. The FTC received all the details of the settlements, reviewing them, and has the authority to challenge them in court. No one can say for certain what the effect will be if we change the process and take away the right of parties to settle their litigation before a court decision. It would be a perverse but not unthinkable result of our actions to decrease the availability of lower-cost generic drugs. Finally, while I strongly believe that we should be protecting mothers and children, pre- and post-born children, from the risks posed by mercury, H.R. 2190, the Mercury Pollution Prevention Act, is the wrong prescription for this illness. In 2005, prior to a new federal regulation and mandate, upgraded technology to further reduce emissions, chlor-alkali facilities were the sixth leading emitter of mercury. This measure, though, holds those other emitters harmless and takes the unprecedented step of banning a manufacturing process. Let me repeat that. This bill suggests that regulations have failed and congressionally mandates the closure of 4 plants. In addition, this legislation creates overlapping and conflicting requirements that are certain to guarantee lawsuits for years to come. Aside from my own concerns that this bill may be a partial taking under the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, I have many concerns about the way this bill operates. If we could quantify the actual benefit to the environment for taking such a drastic action under H.R. 2190, that would be one thing, but we can't. My members and I have numerous amendments, some of which we will offer today, and others that will be reserved until the full committee acts. Again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this markup. I look forward to finding common ground with you on the bills before us to achieve a better legislative product, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the author of one of the bills that we are introducing today, my colleague that we're considering today, my colleague from Illinois, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, for the purposes of opening statements for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the bills that are before us today, and I think really represent the breadth of this committee and the good work that we can do for consumers in so many different aspects. And while all the bills before us are extremely important, I want to discuss H.R. 2190, the Mercury Pollution Reduction Act, a bill I introduced that goes a long way toward protecting public health and the environment by forbidding the hazardous use of mercury cell technology at chlor-alkali plants in the United States. I want to thank the members on our side of the aisle whose districts, whose states are affected by this, for understanding the importance of passing this legislation and for working with me to craft it in a way that they find that they'll be able to support. The dangers associated with exposure to mercury are well documented. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, mercury pollution can do irreparable damage to cognitive functioning in adults and an infant's developing nervous system. It is so dangerous that the federal government has warned pregnant women and those who may become pregnant not to eat fish with high levels of mercury, not to eat fish with high levels of mercury at all, such as swordfish, and to severely limit their consumption of others, such as tuna. A study done by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found that 8% of women aged 16 to 49 had blood mercury levels above the safe level established by the U.S. EPA. Researchers followed up with a report which indicated that unsafe levels of mercury in American women of childbearing age put 630,000 American children born each year at high risk of mental retardation and permanent IQ loss. While only 4 chlor-alkali plants in the United States continue to use the mercury, the impact it has on surrounding communities is severe, and even worse, senseless. Unlike coal-fired power plants, there are readily available alternatives that these companies can and should be using. In fact, converting from mercury cell technology to membrane cell has proven not only to be drastically better for the environment, but also a wise business practice, saving companies millions of dollars in energy efficiency savings. I introduced this legislation because I believe that Congress has a responsibility to minimize the public's exposure to mercury pollution, especially when cleaner, safer alternatives exist. I urge my colleagues to support its passage. I pledge to continue to work with my colleagues on this legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
The chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, for 3 minutes for the purposes of opening statements.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased here also for this markup of the 4 bills. In the interest of time, I'll only briefly address the Data Accountability and Trust Act, which is H.R. 2221, and H.R. 1706, the Protecting Consumer Access to Generic Drugs Act. To begin with, I'm pleased that the Data Accountability and Trust Act is progressing through this committee, subcommittee, in a bipartisan fashion, as you mentioned. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also the ranking member, Mr. Radonovich, the gentleman from California, for working on the manager's amendment that's going to be offered shortly. Congress never wants to legislate in a way that is unnecessarily duplicative of other laws or in a way that could undermine the good intent of a bill. And so I think, Mr. Chairman, the manager's amendment makes important clarifications and changes for those entities that operate fraud databases. We'll also be considering a slightly more controversial bill, in my opinion, this morning, the Protecting Consumer Access to Generic Drugs Act. That's H.R. 1706. Although this bill is well-intentioned, many of my colleagues and I remain concerned that passage of this bill as it is currently written would hinder, not help, consumers' access to generic pharmaceuticals. Now, the availability of generic drugs has helped millions of people live healthier lives and has reduced the price of health care, but interfering with private litigants' ability to settle outside of court, which would be achieved through this bill via a prohibition on reverse settlement payment, is a concern of mine and others. I think these concerns merit more debate, and I ask my colleagues to consider whether a congressional intervention is advisable given that the Hatch-Waxman Act, as currently written today, has been demonstratively successful in getting generic drugs into the hands of consumers while leaving intact financial incentives for research and development of these new drugs. So, Mr. Chairman, I commend you for the markup of these bills. We might not agree on several of them, but I think it's important for the subcommittee to take action on some of these bills that were in previous Congress, and so I look forward to the markup.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Sutton, for 3 minutes for the purposes of opening statements.
Thank you, Chairman Rush, for holding today's markup. From the series of hearings this subcommittee has held, we've had firsthand testimony about the need to address the important issues before us today. For instance, at the legislative hearing for H.R. 1706, the Protecting Consumer Access to Generic Drugs Act, we heard from Commissioner J. Thomas Rush about the Federal Trade Commission's strong support for this bill. And yesterday I spoke with FTC Chairman Leibowitz about this bill, exclusion payments, and the pay-for-delay payments. Chairman Leibowitz mentioned that this is a top priority for the FTC and will lead to considerable savings for consumers. In addition, all of the current FTC commissioners support this bill. We have a responsibility to ensure that settlements between pharmaceutical companies are not anti-competitive. Prescription drug prices are rising faster than inflation, and generics sometimes by as much as 80%. More and more people throughout my district and across this country are struggling during these difficult economic times. Many are faced with the choice between putting food on the table or purchasing prescription drugs, and it shouldn't be this way. Through competition and a healthy brand name and generic pharmaceutical industry, consumers should have access to medication they need at a price that they can afford. The FTC needs the tools provided by this legislation to close loopholes. And in relation to the Consumer Credit and Debt Protection Act, Chairman Leibowitz also testified before this committee at an earlier hearing about the need for standard rulemaking procedures under the Administrative Procedures Act. Consumers trust that the FTC is protecting them from unfair or deceptive acts or practices. When they see ads for debt settlement services, they trust that they will not be deceived or treated unfairly. However, time and time again, we've learned that people are being hurt. They need our help, and it's our responsibility to provide the FTC with the tools to aggressively protect the American people. Granting APA rulemaking authority will arm the FTC and restore consumers' confidence. And I'm supportive of the manager's amendment to the Consumer Credit and Debt Protection Act, of which I am a co-sponsor. This substitute amendment adds payday lending and mortgage foreclosure rescue and loan modification services to the bill. Both of these issues are extremely important to my constituents, and I appreciate the chairman including payday lending as an area the FTC should examine. During the March 24th hearing, I raised the issue of payday lending and how Ohio voters overwhelmingly approved a referendum on payday lenders to end predatory loans. Over the weekend, an op-ed ran in newspapers throughout Ohio highlighting that these lenders continue to exploit loopholes. We need the FTC to examine these practices to protect consumers and restore their confidence. Thank you, and I yield back.
The chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, for 3 minutes for the purposes of opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this markup. Although we are considering 4 bills today, I want to focus on H.R. 1706, Protecting Consumer Access to Generic Drugs Act. I think we all agree that our goal should be to make generic drugs available to consumers who need them. That is why I do not understand why this subcommittee would push a bill that will have a chilling effect on patent challenges by generic drug companies, resulting in longer waiting periods for generic drugs for consumers who depend on them. This bill would place a total ban on all patent settlements in which the company that holds the patent on the brand name drug gives anything of value to the generic company challenging the patent except for an early entry date into the market. What will the results be? With no incentive to settle, cases will be litigated to the very end as brand drug companies fight to hold on to their authorized monopoly on a drug, the only way they have to recoup the millions of dollars they've put into developing and testing new drugs. With millions of dollars of legal fees on the line, generic companies will only challenge a patent if they are virtually assured of a successful outcome. This goes completely against the incentives for generics to challenge patents that are built into existing law. Finally, since 2003, Congress has required that litigants notify federal antitrust authorities of their pharmaceutical patent settlements. DOJ and FTC are already notified of all patent settlements, and they can sue if they believe the outcome of a case is anti-competitive. FTC has filed suit in a number of cases, and in the vast majority, the courts have found these settlements acceptable and refused to strike them down. Mr. Chairman, the system is working. These settlements should be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. To ban these settlements will only keep generics off the market for a longer period of time. Hardly a pro-consumer outcome. I yield back.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 3 minutes for the purposes of opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I know we have 2 competing hearings going on. I was just down in the FDA hearing, and I appreciate arriving back just in time. I'm pleased we're holding the markup to consider these 4 pieces of legislation. I want to commend you for your work on these 4 bills and for your efforts to improve them through the legislative hearings over the last couple of months. I look forward to supporting each of the bills and sending them to the full committee. I'm particularly pleased to see we're taking up the Data Accountability and Trust Act. We have increasingly seen high-profile data breaches occurring over the recent years, from the Choice Point breach to the theft of the VA laptop. It has become clear that due diligence by consumers is not sufficient to protect their personal information. I think the steps the Data Accountability and Protection Act will require brokers that possess consumer information to implement, both with regard to protecting data from being accessed illegally in the first place, and to require proper notification if there is a breach, are much needed steps to protect individuals from potentially devastating effects of identity theft. I want to thank the Chair for his work on this bill over the past Congresses, and I hope the momentum will continue and we will see this bill move through the Congress in the 111th. Exposure to mercury during fetal development can be irreversibly impair children's brain functions as they grow. According to EPA scientists, 1 in 10 women of childbearing age have enough mercury in her body to pose risks to her unborn baby. While there have been much focus on reducing mercury pollution from coal-burning power plants, chlorine and caustic soda production continues. The remaining 4 chloralkali factories that use mercury and chlorine production are located in Ohio, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Georgia, and are major sources of mercury pollution in their respective states. As one way to cut back on mercury pollution, we should pass the Mercury Pollution Reduction Act, which will phase out the use of mercury and chloralkali production within 2 years and require facilities to conduct a mercury inventory within a year of eliminating mercury in their process. Again, I strongly support the bill, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting it. In 1984, the Waxman amendments were enacted to reward ingenuity and encourage competition and development of pharmaceuticals while still allowing for the timely introduction of generic drugs. This balanced approach aimed to make life-saving medicines available to the American public at reasonable prices. It intended to help brand-name drug manufacturers recoup the cost of their investment while also allowing generic manufacturers to challenge weak patents and in turn create competition in the marketplace by providing incentives for generics to enter the market with exclusivity period. Unfortunately, in some instances, the incentives have shifted due to loopholes, and the legislation has been exploited by some pharmaceutical companies and generic drug companies. These loopholes allow them to delay introduction of comparable generic drugs costing the American public billions of dollars each year. The void of affordable generic drugs presents a serious financial hardship for many Americans. Brand name manufacturers, drug manufacturers should be able to profit from research and development of new drugs, but I'm also concerned that the growing trend we're seeing in exclusion payment settlements since 2005 when several federal courts invalidated the FTC's effort to prohibit such exclusionary payments. There's such a direct correlation between the cost of health care and the cost of prescription drugs that we should do all we can to promote competition in the market without taking away the incentives for innovation. I'm pleased we're taking action to correct it by moving forward H.R. 1706, and I look forward to supporting the bill. Mr. Chairman, I also support H.R. 2309, the Consumer Credit and Debt Protection Act. This is a good piece of legislation that will give the FTC authority to more quickly address unfair and deceptive acts and practices in the marketplace to protect the public with regard to consumer credit and debt. These are good pieces of legislation. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting them, and I thank the Chairman for moving forward the bills. I yield back my time.
The Chair thanks the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, for 5 minutes for the purposes of the opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you for holding this important markup. And I want to talk about one particular bill. As the payor of pharmaceutical drugs through the Part D program, the U.S. government, I think, has a responsibility to taxpayers to examine potential anti-competitive behavior which delays market entry of generic drugs. I'm troubled by some of the settlements I've seen between brand name and generic manufacturers. The Sixth Circuit ruled that an agreement between HMR and Andrix Pharmaceuticals to delay market entry of a hypertension drug in exchange for $40 million was per se illegal under antitrust laws, and this kind of behavior is clearly anti-consumer. However, while I'm deeply concerned about allegations of collusion between brand and generic manufacturers to delay the market entry of beneficial drugs, I'm concerned about H.R. 1706 in its present form. I have reservations with the unintended consequences of blanket prohibition of drug patent settlements where there is a payment in exchange for an agreement not to develop, market, or sell a generic drug for a period of time. Rather than allowing Congress to place restrictions on private litigants' ability to resolve disputes, legitimate disputes, I would urge the federal courts to adopt a truncated rule of reason in evaluating whether the use of a reverse settlement in a drug patent suit rises to the level of anti-competitive behavior. With this type of rule, courts would examine whether a settlement between a competitor and a potential competitor was inherently suspect, and if so, It could shift the burden of proof for the brand name manufacturer, the competitor, to make the case for a plausible pro-competitive justification for a reverse settlement. There may be circumstances where when a brand and generic manufacturer enter into a legitimate settlement, and the federal law should not preclude that from occurring. Courts are the appropriate forum for scrutinizing the legality of a settlement. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you drawing attention to this important matter and your efforts thus far. I yield back.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey, for 3 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for calling the markup today on 4 bills that demonstrate the broad and important jurisdiction and work of this subcommittee. Furthermore, I want to commend you, Mr. Chairman, for moving these bills in regular order and by allowing each of them to have hearings at the subcommittee level. It's my ultimate hope that through the amendment process, all of these bills will be moved in a bipartisan fashion. Mr. Chairman, even though I do appreciate the manner in which these bills are being considered, the timing of today's markup makes it feel like we are simply rushing legislation through the subcommittee on issues of importance to the American people, and I believe that this has been evidenced by the way in which today's markup was made known to the members. One bill under consideration today, H.R. 2221, has been drafted in a fully bipartisan way, and I look forward to reporting that bill to the full committee. However, I believe that there will be fundamental difference of opinion between the majority and the minority on the other 3 pieces of legislation, H.R. 1706, H.R. 2190, H.R. 2309 being considered today. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1706, the Protecting Consumer Access to Drugs Act, will prohibit the financial settlements that occur on patent disputes between pharmaceutical and generic drug companies. This prohibition, in my opinion, will delay the ability to reduce the cost of drugs for consumers in the long run. H.R. 2190, the Mercury Pollution Reduction Act, bans the manufacturing of chlorine using the mercury cell process as well as the export of any mercury immediately, and banning the process within 2 years. Yes, there are only 4 manufacturing facilities in the United States that would be affected by this legislation, but one of which is in my home state of Georgia, in fact, indeed my hometown of Augusta, Georgia, and it has the potential to jeopardize American jobs during this time of economic distress. You're talking about these 4 states, West Virginia, Ohio, Georgia, and the other. I don't know how many jobs we're talking about, but 1,000 is certainly too many. I do not think that this subcommittee should pass legislation that would spur further job losses in the manufacturing industry, especially, as I say, during these challenging times, unless the amount of mercury released from these plants is at a dangerous level as determined by the Toxic Substance Control Act. Indeed, if they're overpolluting, then stop them. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 2309, the Consumer Credit and Debt Protection Act, would change the basis by which the FTC promulgates its rules, leaving it vulnerable to more whimsical change through the Administrative Procedures Act, APA authority. Furthermore, I have concerns that the broad enforcement power given to the state attorneys general under H.R. 2309 could yield numerous and, in many cases, frivolous-type lawsuits. Mr. Chairman, I have significant concerns about 3 of the bills under consideration today, as I've mentioned, although I wish we would have had more notice for the markup so as not to rush through the legislation. I do look forward to a spirited debate on these important issues, and I yield back my time.
The chair thanks the gentleman for his remarks. Now the chair opens for consideration H.R. 2221, the Data Accountability and Trust Act. Without objections, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. And the chair will now recess the subcommittee before we begin consideration of amendments to H.R. 2221. Without objections, the subcommittee will stand in recess until 1 p.m. The subcommittee now stands in recess.
H.R. 2221, a bill to protect consumers by requiring reasonable security policies and procedures to protect computerized data containing personal information and to provide for a nationwide notice of the event of a security breach.
All right. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.R. 2221. This substitute this amendment rather, was distributed to all the members yesterday, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
The
2221.
amendment will be considered as read and the original text for purposes of amendment. The chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes for the purposes of a statement on the manager's amendment. The manager's amendment I am introducing is the product of careful negotiations with our friends on the other side of the aisle. The Democratic and Republican committee staff have consulted with all the stakeholders and attempted to address each and every concern that has been raised. I want to emphasize that the bill is still a work in progress and further changes to the bill are in order. I pledge to continue to work with interested stakeholders and with all members of the subcommittee to ensure that the data protection bill is as tight and as effective as possible. There are numerous changes in this amendment, but I will limit my remarks to briefly highlight only the biggest revisions in the underlying bill. First, the manager's amendment ensures that other federal laws are applicable to companies and their data products where appropriate. Stakeholders raised concerns that such laws as the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act were being subverted by this bill. The manager's amendment erases any room for overlapping, dual regulation on these entities that are already complying under GLB and FCRA and other applicable federal laws. Second, the amendment makes numerous changes to the data broker section by narrowing the applicability of those provisions. It also creates a notice exception for instances where law enforcement or national security is implicated. Third, for purposes of the security requirements of the underlying bill, the manager's amendment expands the applicability of those requirements to paper records and authorizes the FTC to expand the definition of, quote, personal information, end of quote. In doing so, the Commission must determine that an expanded definition does not unreasonably impede interstate commerce. There are other changes in the amendment, but these are the large ones, the big ones. I want to thank Mr. Martin, Mr. Radonovich, and the Minority Committee staff for working with me and the Majority Committee staff in this bipartisan collaborative effort. I know that if we continue to work together in this fashion, we will ultimately craft a final bill that we can all enthusiastically support. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman, if
I recognize now for what purposes of the ranking member seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank you and your staff for the great work on the changes proposed by the manager's amendment. This amendment ensures that the bill will not lead to duplicative regulation, nor will it harm the use of important anti-fraud tools. The addition of the breach notification delay for law enforcement or national security purposes is essential as well. This subcommittee markup is an important step, and I want to continue to work with my Democrat colleagues, the FTC, and the stakeholders as we move forward toward the full committee. There remain a few technical issues to work out, including the application of the consumer access provisions in the information broker section. Once we create a new route to information, identity thieves will waste no time in trying to exploit it, and we want to make sure that we don't open a big window when we close a door on fraudsters. Thanks again, Mr. Chairman. I urge all members to support the manager's amendment and support moving the bill forward to the full committee, and I yield back.
The chair thanks the ranking member. Does any other member seek recognition to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. The chair recognizes Mr. Stearns for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to sort of lightly expand on what you mentioned in your opening statement on the manager's amendment, namely talking about Section 2. It allows information brokers to include intentionally false information in a database if that information is used for fraud detection purposes and the information is identified as inaccurate. So it requires the FTC to deem compliance with the Fair Credit Reporting Act or the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act to be in compliance with this act. So we aren't being duplicative, which is good, and these are issues that that we can talk more about. But I think this idea of allowing this intentionally false information to be part of the database is good, because I think lots of times that's probably be the sole source of detecting whether somebody has taken this information, and you can tell it through fraud detection. So I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, the changes you made in the manager's amendment, and I look forward to the markup.
Does any member, other member seek recognition? Does any member seek to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have one for Section 3. Are you going to take it section by section?
Yeah. Yeah, it's open to amendment at any point.
Right.
Mr.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2221 offered by Mr. Butterfield. Page 22, line 16, insert, and the individual
I ask to be recognized, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to offer this amendment this afternoon, but I intend, Mr. Chairman, to offer and withdraw the amendment. But I hope that we can work together to ensure this amendment's inclusion in the bill at full committee markup. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is quite simple. It amends Section 3, subsection E of H.R. 2221 to require that a consumer's credit score accompany the credit report they are able to request if their personal data is compromised as part of a data breach. I am pleased to see that the credit report provision in 2221, and I believe it is part of a monitoring and safeguarding personal information following a data breach. However, just viewing the credit report alone is simply not enough. In order to get a full credit picture and to have an adequate information about an affected consumer's credit history, having free access to one's credit score is also important. As we all know, credit scores and underlying credit history are some of the most vital parts of anyone's financial life. An individual's credit score follows them forever, and it will play a huge role in many major financial situations throughout one's life. Many people think that a credit score only matters when it comes to being approved for a loan or a credit card, but it goes beyond that. A credit score is taken into account when computing insurance premiums, renting a house, and even when applying for a job. For victims of personal data theft, having access to their credit score will help them better manage, track, and monitor credit activity. It offers the affected consumer a point of reference for future credit activity. And so, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity for me to, in these 2.5 minutes, to discuss this amendment. I look forward to working with you and both my Democratic and Republican colleagues on the committee to see that the inclusion of this amendment is included in the final bill that is reported out. At this time, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
So ordered. Is there any other member who seeks recognition? I want to thank the gentleman from North Carolina for his amendment. I applaud the intent of your amendment to help consumers whose information has been compromised. I need more time to understand how your amendment will work within the framework of the bill and the role that credit scores can have in helping consumers after a breach. I promise to work with the gentleman on as this bill moves forward. Any other members seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're very kind, and your staff has been very helpful. I yield back the balance of my time.
Any other members seek recognition? The question now is on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All members in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. All those signify by saying no. Let me say that again. All members in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it, the ayes have it. I now move that the subcommittee report H.R. 2221 as amended. I now move that the subcommittee report H.R. 2221 as amended to the Committee on Energy and Commerce with the recommendation that the bill pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 2221 as amendment to the full committee. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 2221 is reported as amended. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming correction without objection, so ordered.
Where are we at next? We're moving on to the next bill.
I now open for consideration H.R. 2309, the Consumer Credit and Debt Protection Act. Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. H.R. 2309 now considered as read. The clerk will designate Section 1.
H.R. 2190, a bill to amend the Toxic Substances. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I apologize, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 2309, a bill to provide authority to the Federal Trade Commission to expedite rulemaking concerning consumer credit or debt, and to direct the Commission to examine and promulgate rules with regard to debt settlement and automobile sales and for other purposes.
I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to 2309. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2309 offered by Mr. Rush. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title.
Without objection to the amendment will be considered as read and the original text for purposes of amendment. The chairman recognizes himself for 5 minutes for a statement on the manager's amendment. The manager's amendment makes a number of substantive and technical changes to H.R. 2309. The amendment adds 2 new directed rulemakings. It directs the FTC to examine the payday lending industry and determine if rules are needed to prevent unfair and deceptive acts and practices. And I want to thank my colleague from Ohio, Ms. Sutton, for working with me to include this language. And the amendment also includes direction to the FTC to issue rules regarding mortgage foreclosure rescue and loan modification scams. This has been a focus of my friend from California, Ms. Matsui, and I am pleased to include her language in the amendment. The manager's amendment also revises the directed rulemaking on debt settlement and auto finance to clarify that the FTC must issue rules only if it finds rules to be necessary to prevent unfair and deceptive practices. It also makes several technical changes to each of these rulemakings. The amendment also clarifies that rules issued under this section should be treated as any other rules issued by the FTC under its authority in the FTC Act. Lastly, the manager's amendment revises the section on enforcement by state's attorney generals in two critical ways. First, it clarifies that this provision gives states the authority to enforce rules issued by the FTC and does not give them the authority to enforce the entire FTC Act. Second, it modifies the notice provision. Under the amendment, states must provide FTC 30 days prior notice to filing a complaint in federal court and may only file earlier with the consent of the Commission. This change was made at the request of our Republican colleagues. I made the change with the understanding that, quote, Commission consent, end of quote, can be granted by staff and would not require a vote of the commissioners to allow a state to move forward. This manager's amendment was drafted after consultation with our Republican colleagues, the FTC, consumer groups, and industry stakeholders. I'm confident that the process has been fair, and I would like to commend both the majority and minority committee staff for their very hard work. As I stated earlier, the bill continues to be a work in progress, and I pledge to continue to work with all members as we move towards full committee. I urge my colleagues on the subcommittee to support this manager's amendment, and I yield back. Does any member seek recognition to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your interest in looking into and making sure that we do everything we can to go after deceptive practices. I think what concerns me is we just got this substitute. I'm not sure if it looks like we may be throwing the baby out with the bathwater in some areas where the people that lend responsibly might actually get penalized in this by giving Attorney General's civil fine authority, and then I'm not really sure we've had enough hearings on the ramifications for the people that play by the rules and actually provide capital in a time where many people throughout the country are having a very difficult time getting access to capital. I'm concerned that this bill may actually penalize those people that lend responsibly at the expense of those people that are not playing by the rules, as opposed to just narrowly addressing the problems. I think this looks like this amendment by nature of substitute may actually be painting a much broader brush and penalizing some of those people that aren't deceptive, but in fact will then limit the ability to make capital available to people out there across this country, some of our consumers and taxpayers who need that capital made available to them at a time when it's becoming more difficult in the country. So I'm not sure if the Financial Services Committee is also going to be getting this, and maybe the chairman can address that. Is this something that's also going to go through financial services, or is this just an issue that your intention would only go through Energy and Commerce without broader hearings? And I'd yield back.
The chair wants to address some of your concerns. I want to first answer your question. There is no referral of this particular bill to the Financial Services Committee. It has not been referred to the Financial Services Committee. And I know that the gentleman from Louisiana is a very active and engaged and hardworking member of the subcommittee. And I just want to remind him and draw his attention to the fact that we've had 3 hearings on this particular matter. One legislative hearing, 1 hearing on auto lending, and 1 hearing on credit issues in general. And I think that we've exhausted the number of hearings that we should have had on this particular bill, and I know that your concerns are important, but I think that we resolved it as we've gone forward.
And I'll just say that because we just got this amendment in the nature of a substitute, so I'm not sure how that fits in with the original intent of the bill that we had those other hearings on, but I'll yield back.
All right. Gentleman yields back. Does any other member seek recognition to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? The gentleman from Florida, Mr.
It's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the data...
I'm sorry, Mr. Stearns.
Sure.
I should go on this side.
Go ahead.
Ms. Sutton, the young lady from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I won't use all that time. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your work on this bill, and I want to thank you for including payday lending as an area that the FTC should examine. And let me tell you why. Ohio has tried to tackle this issue. By a ratio of nearly 2 to 1, Ohioans voted yes this past November to rein in payday lenders. But only 19 of the more than 1,000 storefronts statewide have licensed themselves under our new state law. Payday lenders are finding loopholes with our new laws and are being very creative. They've started issuing loans in the form of a check and then charging the customer to cash the check. Payday lenders have started charging origination fees as often as every week. And these origination fees are in addition to interest and other fees. These add-on fees send interest rates through the roof and deceptively trap consumers in debt. It's estimated that more than 2/3, or roughly 300,000 payday borrowers in Ohio are trapped each year and pay $318 million in interest and fees. Payday lending preys on consumers who need to borrow money by promising easy, fast cash. Borrowers don't choose to return. They do so often because they're trapped. We need the FTC to look at the practices of providers of payday lending services to determine the need to issue rules preventing unfair or deceptive practices. And we need the FTC to consider issuing rules to prohibit or restrict these practices that trap consumers in debt. Consumers in Ohio have demanded action, and they demanded change last November, and consumers all across the country will benefit by the FTC examining the practices of payday lending, debt settlement services, mortgage foreclosure rescue, and loan modification services, and auto financing. And Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair, thanks to the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hear the gentlelady's comments, and obviously, I guess the state of Ohio did not promulgate legislation that worked effectively, efficiently, or that would have taken care of it. I would think the state could have implemented that. The two things I see of concerns, Mr. Chairman, with the bill, in the recent bill we passed, the data security bill, we have in Section 6, we have preemption of state information security laws. So we have a preemption. And back when we marked up bills, when we were in the majority, in both the, I think the toy bill as well as the data security bill, we had federal preemption, and you don't have it in here. Would the chairman consider having federal preemption so that a vendor, a financial institution would not have to be sued in 50 states, and that we could work out the same language that we had in the toy bill and we had the data security bill? Is just a suggestion I would have. The other thing is that as much as all of us deplore these companies like Payday and others that exploit the credit unworthy people that are having trouble with credit, need cash, there are some legitimate concerns, people that are helping out, that under this bill there would be a rulemaking without not the deliberative process that's been inherent all these years in the rulemaking in the Magnuson-Moss Act, which allows that company to see in advance what the rule is going to be. And I think our concern on this, or my concern I should say, is that if the rule is made by the Federal Trade Commission as an edict preemptively, then these folks will get huge civil fines and possibly be sued in 50 states when they didn't even know what they were doing was irregular or against the law. So I think In those two areas, those are two of my concerns, which perhaps as we move this bill along the line you'll address, but for that reason, without those changes, I perhaps don't think I could support the bill. And I'd yield to the chairman for any comments he might have.
Yeah, I really I'm struggling to try to grasp and to fully understand this particular concern that the gentleman has expressed. This is a very difficult issue, as you well know, and at this point, the chair is not willing to commit to entertaining this particular provision right now, but the chair will, before this bill gets to full committee, the chair and the staff will seek to further clarify what the concerns of the member is at this point in time. I yield back to the. Is there any other member who seek recognition to speak? Does any member seek to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment, but not in the nature of a substitute, but an amendment to the substitute.
All right, the chair recognizes the member of the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Rodanovic, for 5 minutes.
And the amendment is number 1 at the desk, I believe. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Section 2 removes the Magnuson-Moss rulemaking requirements the Commission has been subject to since 1980, and those rulemaking procedures were instituted by Congress to ensure the Commission's rules had been thoroughly considered given the number of broad range of industries subject to the Commission's authority. Under the Administration Procedures Act, the Commission will be allowed to forego the analysis and evidentiary procedures required under Magnuson-Moss and be free to issue specific rules defining unfair and deceptive practices for consumer credit and debt-related issues. I have sympathy for the argument that existing procedures are burdensome, but given the breadth of the entities subject to the FTC's jurisdiction, I can understand why our predecessors wanted to ensure thoughtful rules were promulgated taking into account the various intricacies of each industry. That is even more relevant today, with more industries spanning the gamut of small, independent proprietorships to large companies that only operate in the online space. They are different, and one-size-fits-all rules rarely work. My amendment is a simple amendment that does not undo the premise of an easier rulemaking requirement for the Commission. It is clear we have a difference of opinion on what should be required, and I do not have the votes to change that. However, my amendment does require the Commission to use a regulatory analysis on its rule, but only in the case where it does issue a final rule proposal. The amendment simply requires the Commission to perform an additional analysis that the final rule they are issuing has been weighed and the benefits and adverse economic effects are considered. If we're going to make the rulemaking authority more permissive, I believe it is good public policy that the Commission take this small step to alleviate any concerns that have not been considered on the effects of rules thoroughly. And I urge support of the amendment and yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. In 3 hearings this year, the subcommittee has heard about systemic burdens facing the FTC that prevent it from becoming a nimble, proactive consumer protection agency. In order for the FTC to be able to respond to changing market conditions and give direction to the market about what practices are unfair and deceptive, it must have the same rule-making authority that other federal agencies use. The APA provides a clear framework for notice and comment rulemaking. It is fast, but it also requires agencies to consider alternate views. The amendment before the subcommittee will place new and different burdens on the FTC as it issues rules. It is time that we allow the FTC to operate like other federal agencies and issue rules without additional burdens. Congress has given the FTC APA rulemaking authority many times in the past, and the FTC has a proven track record of careful deliberation. The obligations laid out in this amendment are unnecessary, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Do other members seek recognition on the amendment?
I do. Mr.
Mr.
Chairman.
Stern, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose?
To strike the requisite number of words.
For your recognition?
I think what the ranking member from California is trying to do is just try to put in place some specified rulemaking procedures, which we're hearing from letters that come to us about this, so that in effect this expediting rulemaking authority which you have in this bill is not a rush to judgment, and that we have these sort of steps that Mr. Radonovich mentioned that provides a little bit slower but at the same time more thorough, and when these rules are promulgated, they're not based upon subjective notions of unfairness or perhaps incomplete understanding of what the industry is doing. So I don't think his amendment is really something that's that radical. It's rather probably simple, straightforward. I just urge its adoption because it just is saying to everybody the process by the Federal Trade Commission can still go forward, but we want to make sure that before civil penalties are issued, that these steps are taken, and during those steps that the companies themselves will have an opportunity to follow it and see the rules are promulgated and they can react. So I think it's not a radical change to the bill, but just perhaps a very, shall we say, affirmative and a positive support for the bill.
Is there other members who seek recognition? The gentlelady from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
As this bill addresses, there are those in the business of exploiting those in need. And all the comments that have been made here today reflect that's understood on both sides of the aisle. But what hasn't been quite as broadly reflected in some of the comments is just simply the craftiness and the ability, the agility of some to quickly adjust and continue to exploit. So those crafty exploiters out there do what crafty exploiters would do, and that is respond quickly. Now, in order to address emerging consumer protection issues, the FTC has to be able to act quickly to issue rules defining unfair and deceptive acts and practices. And I agree with the chair that the FTC should have the APA rulemaking authority. It's demonstrated it can use it well. When Congress has seen a need for the FTC to act in this manner, we've granted it the authority to issue rules through the Administrative Procedures Act. For example, using authority granted through the omnibus, FTC is issuing rules relating to mortgages and mortgage foreclosure rescue. And in the 1990s, Congress directed FTC to issue rules governing telemarketing. So they've demonstrated that they can use the APA rulemaking process to issue strong rules that rely on public comment and clear evidence of unfair and deceptive acts and practices. And as has been pointed out here, other agencies have this authority. And the FTC, I don't think, should be singled out to have additional burdensome reporting requirements. You know, by way of example, the banking agencies issue rules using the authority granted to them under the FTC Act. They can use the Administrative Procedures Act. So there's just simply no reason to saddle the FTC with additional procedural hurdles when other agencies do not have to follow the same, and when there is such need to protect our consumers. And I yield back.
Generally yields back. Is there any other member who seek recognition on this amendment? The question is now on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All members in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is defeated. Does any other member seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purposes do the gentleman from...
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, number 2, amendment number 2.
Clerk, will
You have
report
two,
the amendment.
there are two amendments here that are unidentified. Is it something to, what's the word?
There were a total of 3 amendments
Yeah.
identified as 1, 2, and 3. This is amendment number 2.
Let me see it.
This is civil penalties, amendment to strike section 3.
This is Pen 002.
Well, it says
Amendment?
here, amendment number 2, civil penalties, strike section 3.
Got it.
Okay.
Sorry. Amendment to the amendment in the nature
The
of a
amendment has
substitute
been
to H.R.
distributed,
2309.
And without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. And I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Rodano, for 5 minutes to explain this amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Section 3 breaks new ground as it expands the Commission's authority to seek civil penalties for a violation of an unfair or deceptive practice related to consumer debt or credit. To date, the Commission has only been able to seek civil penalties for violations of a rule. Expanding civil penalty authority to any unfair or deceptive practice related to consumer credit or debt will require every business subject to the Commission's jurisdiction to be familiar with and understand the Commission's thinking on what constitutes an unfair and deceptive practice. This means every business that extends credit from local mini-marts to florists or electronics or appliance stores will be subject to a civil penalty for a violation if they don't violate a rule but are deemed to engage in an unfair or deceptive practice. This is a change in policy. Some have suggested that the Commission needed civil penalty authority for violations of the broad unfair and deceptive practices because of the lack of any rules on specific conduct due to their inability to promulgate rules under the more thorough Magnuson-Moss rule-making procedures, which has been cited as an impediment to the rulemaking authority. Section 2 of the legislation now grants the Commission the authority to issue rules under the Administrative Procedures Act, and the Commission is free to promulgate all the rules it desires under relatively easy procedures. Violations of the rules will automatically carry civil penalty authority, so the need to have the additional penalty authority appears to be overkill. And while I think it's appropriate to have civil penalty authority for violations of a rule the perpetrator knew was a violation, I have serious reservations to the requirement this provision will have on businesses to predetermine whether a business practice they may have historically engaged in or which had been an accepted industry practice is suddenly deemed an unfair or deceptive practice subject to fines. To summarize, the Commission's new rulemaking authority will mitigate the need for the additional civil penalty authority of Section 3. The Commission will be issuing rules more easily and more frequently under this Act and will be able to seek civil penalties for violations of those rules. That is a far fairer standard than seeking a penalty for anything the Commission deems unfair or deceptive, where injunctive relief is more appropriate. If the Commission believes a practice is deceptive, they may now engage in a rulemaking to address this concern. I don't have any votes on my side, but I suggest that we also re-examine the ability of the state AGs to obtain civil penalties as the legislation moves forward, and I urge support for the amendment and yield back, Mr. Chair.
The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. The civil penalties provision of this bill provides FTC with important authority that should become law. Under current law, FTC can only seek civil penalties in enforcement actions against violations of rules. The bill will give the FTC the authority to seek such penalties whenever it pursues enforcement action against unfair or deceptive practices related to consumer credit or debt. This authority will enable the FTC to define the truly bad actors who are defrauding the public and to create a deterrent in cases where restitution for consumers is not enough. And I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment to strike the civil penalties section from the bill. Do other members seek? I yield back the balance of my time. And is there any other member who seek recognition on this amendment? Hearing now, the question is now on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All members in favor of the amendment of the amendment signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is defeated.
Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman. For what purpose?
Request a roll call vote.
All right, the roll call vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rush.
No.
Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. No. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space votes no. Mr. Braley. Ms. DeGette. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Radonovich.
Aye.
Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono-Mack.
How is the gentleman from New York recorded?
Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes yes. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Barton.
Thank you.
I apologize. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Green. No. Mr. Green votes no.
Would the clerk report the tally, please?
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 10 and the nays were 14.
The amendment fails for lack of votes. Are there any other members right now who seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. It's number 3. It's the state's Attorney General.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2309 offered by Mr. Rodanovich. At the end of Section 4, insert the following new subsection. H, disclosure relating to the use of private attorneys.
The amendment has been distributed, and without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize myself. I'm sorry. I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes to speak on this bill before I oppose it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is meant to bring transparency to the practice of state attorney generals hiring private attorneys involved in legislating this. The enforcement of federal laws should be the product of independent, even-handed decision-making, free from bias or political interference. Federal and state enforcement officials must abide by numerous statutory provisions to ensure this effect. Delegation of the enforcement responsibility without those safeguards can lead to inefficient and haphazard prosecution efforts and can create opportunities for public corruption. The amendment I'm offering today would ensure that whenever authority to enforce federal laws is placed on non-federal hands for this act, that power is accompanied by the appropriate safeguards. This should be the standard for all federal delegations of authority. This amendment would require public disclosure of information concerning state and local officials, retention of private attorneys, fostering public awareness of these arrangements, and increasing accountability for the relevant government officials. If the state is going to hire private attorneys, their citizens have the right to know who is being hired and under what terms. With access to this information, the public can be more confident that their state and local officials are acting in the public interest without dealings that may benefit private attorneys instead of the general public. This language will in no way hamper the state and local governments, as they will still possess full discretion in every case to make independent, objective judgments about how best to pursue enforcement of federal law, including decisions about whether to retain private attorneys to assist them. This amendment will help ensure the federal law is enforced in an open, principled, and an impartial manner regarding regardless of who exercises the enforcement authority. Former Congressman and now Florida Attorney General Bill McCollum wrote us a letter in support of the greater transparency at the state level. This is an easy amendment to accept, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. This amendment requires that states submit to the FTC a wide range of information about private attorneys who contract with the state to assist in prosecutions. While I understand my colleagues' interest in openness and disclosure, this amendment is misdirected. The FTC is a very busy agency with a staff that is often overworked. It is not clear the purpose of these submissions or what the sponsor of the amendment would like the FTC to do with the information provided. State attorneys general provide an essential consumer protection function. They were the ones who were out in front on subprime mortgage scams, and they have led the way in enforcing against unfair practices among auto dealers, debt settlement companies, and many, many others. Congress should not be in the business of making their jobs more difficult. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Are there any other members who seek recognition on this amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman for what purpose is the gentleman from Florida?
Strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
My colleagues, this is a very simple amendment. You know, Bill McCollum served on the Banking Committee for about 24 years. He's now the Attorney General for the state of Florida. Mr. Radonovich put his letter into the record, which outlines the reason why I think this is so important. So he's intimately aware of all the scams that the chairman talked about. You know, obviously the subprime mortgage scam was successful, but I think what the gentleman from California is doing is very simple. He's just saying, look, if you FTC, which Mr. Chairman you indicated is very busy, and they needed some assistance with their prosecution, well, by golly, okay, if they're going to subcontract prosecution out, why don't we find out that there's no conflict of interest with these private prosecutors? There's been so much conflict of interest today in the financial meltdown. I would think at the very least we want to have some kind of records on who these private attorneys are that the FTC is hiring. And the information that the gentleman from California is asking for is pretty simple. It's transparent. So I wouldn't think anybody in this committee would be against giving records on these private attorneys hired by the Federal Trade Commission to prosecute United States citizens. So in fact, the judge, when he gets the case, also has this information. So I think the amendment is really straightforward, and I just urge my colleagues to support it, especially in light of the fact that the Federal Trade Commission is so busy and they are hiring private prosecutors. And I think anyone in the audience or anyone in this room or listening would want to know everything about that private individual so that he or she would feel that they're getting a fair shake and that this is not something that's stacked against them. So I urge strong support for the amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members who seek recognition? The question is now on the amendment by Mr. Radonovich to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All members in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is. Request a roll call vote. The gentleman requests a roll call vote. The roll call vote will be taken.
Mr. Rush.
No.
Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Ms. Sutton. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Weiner? Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Space? Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes no. Ms. DeGette? Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry votes aye. Ms. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Barton? Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner votes no.
Anyone else who seeks to be recorded? The clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yea... Sorry.
How is the...
not recorded, Mr. Chairman, not recorded.
Where's he?
Who did he just recognize? I didn't see her.
The point was his name wasn't called.
He's not here.
No, but he should be on the list to be called. I think she called. Did she call? I thought.
All right. Did the clerk call Mr. Barton's name?
I apologize, Mr. Barton.
Okay.
I did call him, but I didn't get a response.
Okay. All right. Will the clerk report the
Yes, sir.
vote, please?
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 9 and the nays were 14.
The bill fails for lack of the proper votes. Does any other member seek recognition? If not, there being no further discussion, the question is on the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. I now move that the subcommittee report H.R. 2309 as amended to the full committee with the recommendation that the bill pass. The question is on favorably reporting 2309 as amendment to the committee, full committee. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to, and H.R. 2309 is reported as amendment.
And Mr. Chair, on that I request a recorded vote as well.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will take the roll.
Mr. Rush.
Aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Aye. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Aye. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Sutton. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Radonovich.
No.
Mr. Radonovich votes no. Mr. Stearns.
No.
Mr. Stearns, no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Ms. Bono Mack. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no.
Who do I ask, the chairman? Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Sutton.
Yes.
Ms. Sutton votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack votes no. On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 16 and the nays were 9.
right. I now open for consideration the bill H.R. 1706, the Protecting Consumers' Access to Generic Drugs Act. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendments at any points. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. This is not a partisan issue. All 4 current commissioners, both the Republicans and the Democrats, and the independents support the bill. The past Republican chairman of the FTC has supported this bill. This bill has been estimated by the FTC to save taxpayers and consumers billions of dollars. The bill does not prohibit settlements in drug patent disputes. It only prohibits a specific type of evasion where the brand company pays the generic company to stay off the market. And we do not see these types of settlements in any way commercial, in any other commercial sector. They are completely unique to the drug industry. The regulatory framework of Hatch-Waxman is what gives rise to these unique settlements. History shows that drug companies were able to settle their patent disputes without reverse payments provision. And without, I would ask that all members support this bill. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and does any member seek to offer an amendment to this bill?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman has an amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
It's Amendment 1, GAO study.
The
Amendment to H.R.
The amendment has been distributed, and without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize the gentleman from California for 5 minutes to explain this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hatch-Waxman encourages generics to challenge brand drug patents not only because of the increased reward for litigation success it offers, but also because of the broad spectrum of possible positive outcomes available to them as a result of their improved bargaining position granted to them by the Act. Unless the FTC promulgates rules otherwise, this legislation would essentially eliminate this second benefit of Hatch-Waxman, leaving expensive, high-stakes litigation as the only remaining viable course. H.R. 1706 would make essentially all types of pharmaceutical patent settlements unlawful when they involved anything other than an immediate launch of a generic, such as agreements in which the generic drug company receives anything of value in exchange for agreeing not to research, develop, manufacture, market, or sell their generic drug for a period of time. I'm concerned that this fundamental shift away from the current Hatch-Waxman structure towards a more costly, high-stakes, winner-takes-all litigation. The companies have stated their decision analysis will necessarily have an adverse effect on generic companies' incentives to challenge patents. Fewer challenges will mean fewer affordable, life-saving drugs. This amendment would direct the GAO to study the impact of these agreements on the number of generic drug applicants, the number of patent challenges filed, and how many of those drugs are litigated to the bitter end rather than being settled before or after passage of the bill. Additionally, GAO will analyze the number of generic drugs brought to market before and under this new regime. GAO will begin to study 2 years after enactment and then update it yearly thereafter for 4 years. This study will provide us with the information needed to determine whether this act accomplishes the goal of saving consumers more money by bringing more generics to market sooner. If it doesn't, we know we'll have to go back to the drawing board. I am confident in that the GAO and its strong culture of independent objective analysis to carry out this task. As an agency without a vested interest in the implementation and enforcement of this Act's provisions, I'm sure that the GAO will be able to provide Congress with clear, unbiased analysis of this Act's impact on consumer access to generic drugs. This is the purpose of the GAO study, to provide a nonpartisan, unbiased analysis. I understand that you are supportive of this idea, Mr. Chairman, but may have a few suggestions. I look forward to working with you between now and the full committee to committee markup to improve this study. The more data we gather, the better picture we will have. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and help ensure that substantial changes in the pharmaceutical drug system are accompanied by responsible oversight. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman
I certainly will.
the chair supports this amendment as the gentleman indicated, and would urge all members to also support this particular amendment.
Thank you, Mr.
Okay. Is there any other member who seek recognition? The question is now on the amendment by Mr. Radonovich to H.R. 1706. All in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Does any other member seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. It's number 2, the FTC review factors and expedited judicial review.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1706 offered by Mr. Radonovich. Strike subsection A through C of section 2 and insert the following. A, enforcement actions relating to settlement.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. I recognize the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes to explain this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Generic drug companies need strong encouragement to undertake the financial burden of patent challenge litigation. Patent challenge litigation is lengthy, lasting years, and expensive, which costing millions of dollars for both sides. It's an impossible financial burden for a drug company unless it can recoup its investment upon a successful challenge. Hatch-Waxman created this strong incentive, a 180-day exclusivity period during which the challenger will be the only generic drug provider in the market. H.R. 1706 will erase current incentives for generic drug companies to challenge patents, forcing every patent challenge through the full course of litigation because a brand drug company does not have any incentive to bargain away its authorized monopoly on patented drugs, while a generic drug company has no incentive to settle for anything less than an immediate launch date. Just because money or other compensation is involved does not make the deal anti-consumer. Patent litigation is expensive. The outcomes are often uncertain, and the odds for success or failure are about even when you consider whether a generic drug launch results. H.R. 1706 will achieve the opposite of the intent. Consumers will wait longer for more affordable drugs. Consumers will wait an average of 5 to 9 years for access to cheaper drugs because generic drug companies will wait until drug patents expire before bringing their generic product to the market. Unwilling to bring a patent challenge because of the lack of a mechanism to recoup their investment in legal fees. Reverse payment settlements do not keep generic companies off the market altogether, but sometimes lead to generic drugs coming to market years before they otherwise would have. Congress should not limit the ability of private litigants to settle. Placing restrictions on private litigants' ability to settle disputes is without precedent. In no other area of the law has Congress stepped in to prevent, restrict, or define private litigants' ability to settle legal disputes out of court. Congress has already balanced the marketplace interests with consumers' best interest. Both the FTC and the DOJ have tools to challenge suspect settlements in court. That the courts have reviewed so many settlements and have refused to throw out so many settlements sends a clear signal that we should not look at drug patent settlements as anti-competitive on their face. My amendment would preserve the ad hoc, fact-specific review while addressing the FTC's concerns that courts don't act quickly enough in this arena to protect consumers' interests. Instead of banning all the settlements that include consideration other than the date of the entry, my amendment will codifies those factors the courts have said are key in determining whether pharmaceutical settlements are anti-competitive. Remaining patent time, fair market value of consideration, ability of the generic to enter the market early, and court orders. Where the FTC determines a settlement is anti-consumer, my amendment provides for expedited judicial review of an FTC challenge. I support this amendment and yield back, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes in opposition to this amendment. This amendment is arguably worse than the status quo that we currently operate under, because it burdens the FTC with a complicated analysis of all drug patent settlements. The amendment will require the FTC to look at factors that it has already considered. This defeats the purpose of the bill. The point of the bill is to overrule those courts that have ruled against the FTC, not to codify those decisions into law. H.R. 1706's right-line prohibition on reverse payments is much better than a case-by-case analysis, because it establishes certainty and does not allow companies to, quote, game, end quote, the system. The public interest language of the amendment could potentially allow any agreement to be legal. Under H.R. 1706 as written, the FTC already has discretion to exempt other reverse consideration provisions if they are pro-competitive and serve consumer interests. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any other members who seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition? The gentleman from Florida. For what purposes do you seek
Strike the
recognition?
last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Let me just say that this is a good amendment. You say worse than makes the bill worse. I don't see how that could possibly be, Mr. Chairman. It's actually, as the gentleman from California said, it determines settlement in such a way that it expedites judicial review. And all of us, if you look at the record, the FTC has lost a lot of these cases. And think if you're going to court with the FTC and this goes on and on and on, it's just huge legal fees for you. And since the record has shown the FTC has lost, his amendment simply steps forward and say that, you know, when an amendment, this amendment just will provide for this expedited judicial review. I don't think anybody could be against providing expedited review. It's good for the FTC. We want to get this over and move on. Just because money or other compensation is involved does not make the deal anti-consumer. Patent litigation is expensive, and we all know that. Oftentimes the outcomes are uncertain. They go on for years. And the odds of success or failure, we just don't know when you consider a generic drug launch. So anything in this bill that will expedite judicial review, I think, is positive. So I urge my colleagues to support it. And I yield back.
And the gentleman yields back. Is there any other member who seeks recognition? The question is now on the amendment by the gentleman from California to H.R. 1706. All members of the amendment who are in favor, all members in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is defeated.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will record the vote.
Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Weiner. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Ms. Zagat. Ms. Zagat votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bonomack. Ms. Bonomack votes aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no.
Have all members been recorded? The clerk will read the results.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 9 and the nays were 16.
The amendment is defeated. Does any other member seek to offer an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1706 offered by Mr. Stearns. At the end of the bill, insert the following, Section 7, sunset. This act and the amendments made by this act shall cease to have effect on the date that is 6 years after the date of enactment of this act unless, 1, the Comptroller General finds pursuant to the study required under Section 6 that the act has benefited.
The amendment has been distributed and without objection the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first of all compliment you and thank you for accepting the First Amendment from Mr. Radonovich, which sets up a GAO audit. And I think it's, it's bipartisan. We want to see the results of this legislation, and I think the gentleman from California, his amendment best does this with his study. So my amendment follows up with the GAO study, and it's rarely, my colleagues, that you have an opportunity when you vote to sunset a government program, and here is a unique opportunity for you. In this particular case, we're dealing with three competing interests: generic drug makers, consumers, and innovative drug makers. My amendment would make certain that first and foremost, the consumer's access to safe and affordable generic drugs is protected by this legislation. In testimony before this committee, the majority witnesses themselves contended that by repealing reverse payment settlements, the consumer would benefit by the quicker introduction of generic drugs through the patent challenge process. But then, unfortunately, none of the witnesses, I repeat that, none of the witnesses could offer evidence that this would in fact be true. The only evidence that they did agree upon was that since the Hatch-Waxman Act, the generic drug market has increased its market share from around 20% to 80%, utilizing reverse payment settlements. So, in a nutshell, the witnesses confirmed that the Hatch-Waxman Act worked and generic drugs were offered from 20% to 80%. So my amendment simply works off the gentleman from California, Mr. Radonovich's amendment. We simply say that after 6 years, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but after 6 years, 6 long years, we'll simply sunset this legislation after the date of its enactment unless the GAO determines that this bill has actually increased consumers' access to generic drugs as it's intended to do. So in effect, if all of you believe in this bill, you're going to support this bill, you support the GAO audit, then this gives perhaps a final resort to terminate this if it's not working. So why would we want to keep legislation that's not working? If the GAO shows it's not working, it's conclusive, then would you want to continue this bill? No. So I think by you supporting my bill, you're saying, okay, if the GAO comes out and says it's not working, we see very incremental amount, then by golly, then the program should sunset. So I believe this can be a bipartisan amendment, Mr. Chairman, like the one that Mr. Radonovich offered to set up the GAO study. And in the end, we'll protect consumers. If the GAO is correct, the legislation is not needed. And so it gives proof to the pudding. And as I say, my colleagues, this gives you an opportunity to sunset a piece of legislation that's not working. And I think in the end, we're all for affordable prescription drugs for people, but we want to make sure the legislation we pass works, and this pretty much puts in place, I think, remedies if it's not working. So with that, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. The gentleman was correct. I did and do support the Radonovich amendment regarding the GAO, but I just cannot support this amendment. The amendment changes the presumption of the bill. It assumes that the bill will not work. The assumption should be that the bill will do exactly as advertised and save taxpayers and consumers money. Sunsets are rarely good. They put an unfair burden on Congress to act. The burden should be reversed. Sunset provisions only make sense when there is a reasonable belief that the problem will be resolved in the future. There is absolutely no reason to presume that drug companies won't engage in uncompetitive exclusion payment settlements in 6 years. After the GAO study, if the report finds that there hasn't been savings, then Congress can always pass legislation based on the findings of the GAO report. The amendment makes an exception if the GAO finds that the underlying bill has, quote, benefited consumers, end of quote, and increased the availability of generic drugs. GAO rarely, if ever, makes these types of recommendations. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Will the gentleman yield as part of his time?
Sure, the chair yields.
Reluctantly. Okay. You know, we're not saying the presumption is this bill will fail. We don't necessarily going to support it, but by this amendment, we're not saying your bill's going to fail. We're going to say, let's give it a chance. Let's let the GAO audit that you've agreed to have, and if it comes out that generic drugs are not increasing, it's not working, and the whole intent of the legislation is bogus, then why not let the bill sunset and then see what happens from there? But your statement that the presumption is that the bill will fail is not part of this amendment. And the other last thing I would say is that you have the feeling that Congress should not be forced to act if they fail here. But I'm sure that Mr. Waxman, yourself, if it turns out the GAO audit shows it's not working, the bill is going to continue going on anyway. You know, you can actually go back and stop the bill, but you and I both know it's harder to stop a government program once it starts than to let it.
The chair reclaims this time.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Again, the Congress can always pass legislation based on the findings of the GAO report. We always have that responsibility and that requirement, and so we can always do that. Is there any other member who seeks recognition? The question is now on the amendment by the gentleman from Florida to H.R. 1706. All members in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. All those opposed by saying no. And the opinion of the chair, a recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rush?
No.
Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Schakowsky? No. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Ms. Sutter? I'm sorry, Ms. Sutton? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gordon? Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Weiner?
The chairman's recorded voting no.
Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space votes no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley, no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Stearns? Aye. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Aye. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono-Mack? Ms. Bono-Mack votes aye. Mr. Terry? Aye. Mr. Terry votes aye. Ms. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no.
Have all members been recorded? The clerk will report the results.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 10 ayes and 15 noes.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment,
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Done.
The ayes were 10 and the nays were 15.
thank you for the correction. I got it. And that, in my opinion, the bill is defeated. The amendment is defeated for lack of votes.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose is the gentleman from California?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The failure to market forfeiture provision identifies the limited set of circumstances in which a first generic filer is forced to launch its product or lose its 180-day exclusivity period, even if it's in the midst of litigation over the patent. This means a generic company has to choose between launching its product at risk or forfeiting its exclusivity. That's not much of an incentive to risk the amount of money it takes to mount a strong patent challenge. The proposed legislation would force the first generic filer to launch or lose if anyone for any reason has a declaratory judgment action dismissed for want of subject matter jurisdiction. Since its dismissal for want of jurisdiction is not a judgment on its merits, this means that the first applicant would be forced to launch or lose even in circumstances where no one has been judicially cleared to launch a product. For example, if a first applicant who has been enjoined from launching its product pending an upcoming trial on the merits would see its exclusivity evaporate simply because someone has filed a lawsuit that is found for any reason not to satisfy the minimum standards for justiciability set forth in Article 3 of the Constitution. This greatly diminishes the value of the first applicant's exclusivity and is both arbitrary and unfair. If cash or non-cash compensation agreements are prohibited, the generic drug company has no incentive to settle for anything less than an immediate launch date for their product or recoup their investment in legal fees. A brand drug company, however, has no incentive to permit an immediate launch of a generic product and will force the litigation to conclusion. As a result, a generic company will only undertake the financial burden if it's assured of the litigation success or near impossibility, particularly in patent litigation. H.R. 1706 will achieve the opposite of the intent. Consumers will wait longer for more affordable drugs, and consumers will wait an average of 5 to 9 years for access to cheaper drugs because generic drug companies will wait until drug patents expire before bringing their generic product to the market, unwilling to bring a patent challenge because of the lack of a mechanism to recoup their investment in legal fees. Mr. Chairman, I understand that I know that you have expressed an interest in this issue and also an interest in your willingness to work on this issue before the full markup, and I yield back the time and look forward to working with you on a resolution to this matter.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now does have an interest and will commit to working with the gentleman. Is there any other member who seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry. We have a series of votes on the floor. What's the chairman's wish about voting on any other amendments or passage before we go to the floor?
The chair would like to get H.R. 1706 vote on H.R. 1706 before we go, and then when and we will recess the subcommittee, and then we will reconvene at the conclusion of the 4 votes on the floor, and immediately after the conclusion of the last vote, and we will consider H.R. 2190. All right. With that, the chair now moves that the subcommittee report H.R. 1706 as amended to the Committee on Energy and Commerce with a recommendation that the bill passes. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 1706 to the committee. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, as ayes have it, the motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1706.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rush.
Aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky.
Aye.
Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Space. Mr. Space votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Radonovich.
No.
Mr. Radonovich, no. Mr. Stearns. No. Mr. Stearns, no. Mr. Whitfield. No. Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, no. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, no. Mr. Barton. No. Mr. Barton, no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 16 ayes and 10 noes.
The amendment passes. The bill passes, rather. The bill passes. And I ask that unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming corrections without objection so ordered. The committee will stand in recess now until the conclusion of the fourth vote on the floor. The subcommittee will again be called to order for the purpose of reconvening. Now I open up for consideration the bill H.R. 2190. But before we enter the discussion of 2190 and consider that, we still have some unfinished business that on the data bill that we need to complete. I would like to enter into a colloquy with my good friend, Mr. Radonovich. And I have some concerns about the scope of the exemption for certain companies in Section 2C. I believe that the intent of this provision is to ensure that if an entity is merely providing the transmission capability for information, it will be exempt from complying with the data security requirements of the bill. That is the right policy because this legislation is about the person who owns or possesses personal information. Therefore, to hold an entity liable who merely provides the quote, pipes, end of quotes, to transmit the data is not consistent with the intent of the bill. Indeed, the entity that is moving along the data may not know that the data includes personal information as defined by this act. With that intent in mind, we are concerned that the exemption as drafted may be overbroad and includes entities that are acting as the owner of the information and should be required to safeguard that data. We intend to work with our colleagues on the subcommittee on communication technology and the internet, as well as all interested stakeholders to address these concerns. We hope to draft a more narrowly tailored exemption to ensure that we cover those entities that should be covered and exclude those entities that should be exempt. And this is and will continue to be a bipartisan effort. I yield now to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Radonovich.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. I agree we need to get this language right and look forward to working in a bipartisan way with you, the CT&I subcommittee, industry, and consumer groups. The intent of this provision is to ensure that a provider acting as a conduit for information is not subject to the requirements of H.R. 2221. We need to ensure that we accomplish that goal. At the same time, we do not intend to expand the FTC's jurisdiction to include entities which they don't currently regulate. It's important that we carefully review the language just a minute, in the exemption and take the time to get this right before full committee markup. I agree with you that we would like to proceed in a thoughtful way and have a robust discussion with stakeholders to ensure that the appropriate parties are required to safeguard personal information under this act. And while those entities are simply providing the pipes for transmission are exempt. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
With that in mind, I thank the gentleman from California. And now the bill H.R. 2190, the Mercury Pollution Reduction Act, is now will be called up, and without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. H.R. 2190, now considered as read. The clerk will designate Section 1.
H.R. 2190, a bill to amend the Toxic Substances Control Act to phase out the use of mercury in the manufacture of chlorine and caustic soda and for other purposes.
I offer an amendment, H.R. 2190, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2190. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Rush. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert Section 1 short title. This act may be cited as the Mercury Pollution Reduction Act. Section 2 findings.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read and original text for purposes of amendment and will be open to amendment at any point. I would like to engage in a colloquy now with Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Chairman Rush, and I want to thank Representative Schakowsky for your work on this measure. And one of the 4 chlorine plants still using mercury to produce chlorine is run by Ashta Chemicals in Ashtabula, Ohio, where they're headquartered. Ashta is a smaller, privately held company and serves customers from 6 production sites, 19 liquid terminals, and 5 warehouses located in the U.S. and Canada. Ashta has expressed concerns about the availability of financing to convert their process, especially in our current economic climate, and their ability to pay back borrowed money. As this bill moves forward, Mr. Chairman, I think it's important that we consider this issue as we reach the goal of ending the use of mercury while growing and creating more jobs. I want to work with the chairman and my good friend from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, to examine the financial concerns as we move ahead.
I want to thank the gentlelady, and I want her to know that I am sympathetic to the concerns that you have raised about making this type of investment during the current economic climate. I share the gentlelady's commitment to ensure that more jobs are created in our country and look forward to working with you on this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Space, you seek recognition. Mr. Space?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to echo the sentiments of my colleague from Ohio, Congresswoman Sutton, on this matter. I believe there are some improvements that can be made to this bill to provide greater workability to companies subject to the mandates of the legislation. In particular, I'm concerned about the ASHTA facility that Ms. Sutton referred to, which is in Ohio, as well as that of the PPG facility in West Virginia, which is not far from my congressional district in southeastern Ohio. A number of my constituents cross the state line and the Ohio River and go to work at that plant every day. It's my understanding that ASHTA in particular has significant concerns regarding the financing required to upgrade their equipment, and I'd like to discuss that particular issue further as we move forward. I'm looking forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and Congresswoman Schakowsky, who I, in this statement, praised for her hard work on this very worthwhile bill, as the rest of our colleagues continue to improve this bill at the full committee level. I yield back.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes himself for the purposes of 5 minutes on behalf of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This amendment is the result of the thoughtful deliberation following verbal and written input in the form of comments from affected stakeholders. The manager's amendment makes the following notable changes to the bill. First, the amendment makes clear that chlorine production facilities can legally store mercury on site at facilities already permitted for storage under existing law. This ensures that such companies will have a storage option during and after conversion and until a long-term storage facility designated by the Department of Energy becomes available in 2013. This change was made in response to input from committee members and from affected companies that have stated an explicit provision to allow short-term storage was needed. Second, this amendment strikes all new reporting and inventory requirements from the bill. This change was made in response to input from our friends on the other side of the aisle and from affected companies that stated these requirements might prove to be burdensome and duplicative. I would like to emphasize that these proposed changes result from careful consideration of the comments of industry stakeholders and majority and minority staff. And allow me, please, to commend the committee staff for their attentiveness and hard work on these important safety and environmental matters. And I would urge my colleagues on the subcommittee to support this manager's amendment. Does any members seek, I yield back the balance of my time. Does any member seek recognition to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes Mr. Radonovich for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I support protecting Americans from harmful exposures to mercury, and while the amendment in the nature of a substitute is a dramatic improvement over the underlying bill, the direction and the policy it calls out is troublesome. The legislation takes the unprecedented step of statutorily banning a manufacturing process for an industry that's already highly regulated under several federal and state laws. In fact, based on 2005 data from the EPA, mercury cell chlorine plants were the 6th highest mercury emitter in the United States. Yet even though the domestic chlorine makers that employ mercury cells have seriously reduced their emissions under both voluntary and mandatory actions, this bill does nothing to address those industries with higher mercury emissions. The bill's supporters argue that these mercury cell plants are expensive and it is easy to quickly convert to another manufacturing process, be it asbestos diaphragm or membrane cell, but that the cost effectiveness of implementing alternative production technologies must be measured on a site-specific basis. Industry has informed us that the chlor-alkali plants are extremely capital intensive and costly to build. The cost for such conversion at an individual site is likely in excess of $100 million and may be significantly greater for a large site. In many cases, plants will not be rebuilt, with implications for local markets and loss of jobs in the local communities. The bill's supporters want fish without mercury and claim that this bill is the ticket, but we should be careful to ensure that it will measurably decrease the global mercury. A recently released United States Geological Survey investigation found that increases in the methylmercury, the most potent form of mercury in seafood in the Pacific Ocean, is tied directly to activity in Asia, and that there is an expected increase there over the next 40 years. In addition, the European Union, considered by many of the bill's supporters as a pantheon of environmental oversight, has many more mercury cell chlorine plants in operation than the United States, but is pursuing a voluntary phase-out by the year 2020 rather than a quick ban. We should not cavalierly surrender U.S. jobs if an entity that big with a record of precautionary action sees no need to do the same and will ramp up production to meet needs in the United States. In addition to the larger policy question, the bill and its amendment renegotiate a mercury export ban that is barely 8 months old and enjoyed substantial bipartisan and stakeholder support. Before we take such a drastic step to overturn a full record, and flank our parties in support of the approach, we should have clear examples of where the law is lacking. The export ban law was a thoughtful approach that covered several industries, and I do not know of a reason to arbitrarily change it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yield back his time.
I do yield back. Thank you very much.
Okay. The gentleman yield back his time. Does any member seek to offer an amendment to the amendment?
No, Mr. Chairman, may I?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
The chair now recognizes for what purpose is the gentlelady from Illinois recognized?
To strike the requisite number of words.
All right, the chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take 5 minutes. I think that the manager's amendment reflects a real desire to reach a consensus on this piece of legislation, both recognizing the pretty drastic threat that mercury is to not just the environment, but can cause serious and permanent damage, particularly to children, but also to recognize the problems of the economy and the problems of jobs. And I know that what I heard from the colloquies that you had, and certainly in coming up with this substitute, all of the stakeholders have been participating and will continue to participate as we move this bill forward. So my hope is that we can get broad support in the committee today and continue to work together to perfect this legislation that both protects people and the environment, and also considers the jobs and the manufacturers. I yield back.
Does any other member seek time? The chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I don't think I'll take 5 minutes. I think it's a measure of respect that the minority has for yourself and Mrs. Schakowsky that we are being as cooperative as we're being on this particular bill. It is amazing to me, and I have let Mr. Radonovich, as our ranking member, do most of the work with several other members on this particular bill of the subcommittee, but we're in the process of banning a process, which I can't recall in the 25 years I've been in Congress and the 23 on this committee we've ever done before. We have 4 plants in this country that use this process. It's unclear exactly how many people work in those plants, but it's somewhere between 400 and 1,000. And if this bill were to become law, those jobs just go away in 2 years. They just go away. And the underlying bill goes and eviscerates a bill that we supported in the last Congress that's a much broader, comprehensive bill for no apparent reason. Again, you know, we're going to vote against the bill and work at the full committee with the author and the subcommittee chairman and the full committee chairman. But I don't see what public good we're doing unless there's a decision that we just want to unilaterally surrender economic competitiveness in U.S. jobs because we can, and we're the U.S. Congress. So I was hopeful in discussions with staff and Mr. Radonovich that there might be something that could actually be worked out on this bill. And I think Mr. Radonovich is going to offer an amendment to phase this thing out to 2020, which is when the Europeans do. But I would sincerely hope that some members of the majority might consider voting with us in the minority to prevent this bill going forward. And if we really need to do something on this particular process, let's try to do it in a bipartisan way. But as the bill stands, I mean, it's just a death knell for how many ever the workers are in these 4 plants, plain and simple. And we're not banning mercury, so you don't get the health benefit. You just penalize these 4 plants that use this particular process because we can. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Does any other member seek to speak on?
Mr. Chairman, on this side.
No, on this side, we'll come to you next. Mr. Merrill, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. I want to echo some of the sentiments that have been expressed earlier. Unlike Mr. Space and Ms. Sutton, whose districts are real close by and touching concern the operations of some of these plants, I actually have one of the 4 remaining in this country in my district. There are only 4 left in the country, I think, 3 owners, 4 plants, and I can put a personal spin on this. 150 people work at the plant in my district. That's 150 families that are depending on the breadwinners who work there. It's a multi-million-dollar economic payroll in the town, and they support a lot of businesses in the area, which will have to get their chlorine from much farther distances and greater costs if the business is shut down. As it's written, this bill puts me in the tough spot of having to choose between the jobs in my district and the quality of the environment that folks in my district live in. And I've been working with folks on this process, see if we can't serve both purposes at the same time, see if we can incentivize the folks to switch over, change the process, keep the jobs, but get rid of the processes that are contributing so much to the problem. If we want to encourage these facilities to switch, seems to me we've got to be reasonable in the time span that we allow them to do it, but not be so reasonable that we end up forfeiting the principle of trying to get folks off a dirty process and onto a clean one. But one of the sticking points here is that folks, like the people in my district, have to decide at some point whether they're going to switch or whether they're going to continue to run out the clock as we set the clock and run as long as they can with the technology they've got in place. That decision is made a whole lot more complicated by the current economic climate. I've been working with the constituents in my district, the stakeholders in my district, with the author of the bill, with the committee staff to try and find a solution that works out a reasonable pathway for us to see if we can't continue the jobs that are represented by this employer, but convert the process to get them off the dirty process and on something that's clean. And I'm going to continue to work on that with the other folks. But I do want to express my support to the author of the bill and to the chair for the leadership in this issue. It is something that needs to be addressed. I think there is a reason for us to address the process. If it's the product that offends, address the product. If it's the process that offends, we have to address the process. The product is good. We need the product. We need the product in as many places as we can get it reasonably and safely, and the closer to the customer, the better for all concerned. So I think there's a reason for us to focus on the process. I just want us to do it in a way that allows us to try and incentivize folks to convert rather than just to shut down. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Does any other member seek recognition? Dr. Gingrich for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. And I really want to just echo my colleague from Georgia, Mr. Barrow, in regard to the issue here. And I'm from Augusta, Georgia. That's my hometown. And the plant that my colleague is talking about Olin plant in a section of Augusta we always refer to, John, as the Miracle Mile. And there were a lot of jobs there, a lot of the 150 jobs Representative Barrett talks about, and it's hugely important that we don't just come in with an axe handle and slash all these jobs. That we ought to, in my opinion, Mr. Chairman, we ought to look very closely at an opportunity to do something to incentivize them to switch over and not just shut down. I'm going to have an amendment, Mr. Chairman, in a few minutes in regard to that. But I think you heard from Ms. Sutton, you heard from Mr. Space, you heard from Mr. Barrow and myself, and these are hard-working, salt-of-the-earth Americans who, whether it's 150 jobs in Augusta, Georgia, or a total of 1,000 or 1,200 across the country, we ought to work with the author of this bill, who I have great respect for, as we go forward and try to work out some compromise. Mr. Chairman, at the outset, you said that you would work very closely with the members that expressed concern on both sides of the aisle. I know you'll do that. You're an honorable chairman, but we just can't feel their pain. We've truly got to do something for them, and I feel very strongly about this. I think Mr. Barrow is absolutely right on target, and with that, I'll yield back.
Is there any other member who seeks to speak on the amendment, on the bill, rather? Amendment. All right. Does any member seek to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read. Well, I recognize Mr. Radonovich for the purposes of offering an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think I have a number, but it's to move the ban date to 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Radonovich. Page 4, beginning on line 22, strike the date 24 months after the date of enactment of this section and insert January 1, 2020.
The amendment has been distributed, and without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Radonovich will be recognized for 5 minutes to explain your amendment.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The companies affected by this bill have testified that forcing them to close and convert in 2 years, as both the underlying bill and the amendment in the nature of the substitute do, is impossible and amounts to a death sentence for their employees' jobs. Specifically, 2 years provide no real opportunity for any existing facility to meaningfully or even remotely transition. To seriously transition, a company needs to design, engineer, finance, especially in the current market, permit, contract, construct, and begin operation of their facility. This process is guaranteed to take a decade depending on how smoothly things go. In the meantime, the Europeans have had many more mercury chloralkali plants than the United States, but instead of a 2-year timeline before the ban, the EU has decided to phase out mercury cell chlorine manufacture by 2020. That EU date is not a hard deadline with enforceable legal provisions. We all know how well the EU does in meeting self-imposed environmental deadlines and targets. By forcing our plants to close at least 10 years before the Europeans under this bill, we give these foreign plants and their employees competitive advantages over our domestic manufacturers and incentivize foreign plants to stay open longer, since they will not have competition from our workers. In addition to the simple 10-year advantage this bill provides EU companies and workers on the chlorine side, it also significantly advantages EU chloralkali plants that make potassium hydroxide. Among other things, potassium hydroxide is used to make soap, disinfect water, and de-ice airplanes. 50% of potassium hydroxide used in the United States, a byproduct of chlorine made with a mercury cell, is made in the United States. This bill would make us dependent on foreign sources from the EU and enrich those companies that use mercury. This amendment, my amendment, synchronizes the U.S. ban in H.R. 2190 with the target ban in Europe, thereby leveling the playing field both from a trade balance perspective as well as gives the existing 4 domestic facilities a fighting chance to meaningfully make investments, obtain permits, save jobs, without a mercury cell process. We should not voluntarily wave the white flag when it comes to American jobs. If you want parity in trade, sanity in planning, and equity for workers, you should support the Radonovich Amendment to extend the deadline for phase-out to the year 2020. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Any other members seek recognition? For what purposes is the gentlelady from Illinois seek recognition?
To speak against the amendment, if I could.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
If this were just a discussion about jobs, this would be very simple. But we're talking about mercury, one of the most toxic substances that is known to man. And this isn't about parity with Europe and the United States. We're talking about the release, if the bill is deadline is extended to 2020, the release of about 9,000 pounds of additional mercury. This mercury isn't going to Europe. It's going in the communities where these plants are located. And the result of that is that women who are pregnant get these high levels of mercury in their blood, and about 630,000 American children are born each year at high risk of mental retardation and permanent IQ loss. That's why we're trying to find the right balance here, and 2020 allows for this toxic chemical to keep accumulating and being released in the communities around these plants. Now, you know, we can make all kinds of arguments about how all these other plants, except for these 4, have made the conversion, about the higher energy costs it takes to run a plant that uses this process. All of those things are true, but I think what we have to consider is what is the bottom line? What is the trade-off here, and how do we best resolve it? You know, we are willing to talk about extensions, but certainly not to 2020 because of the critical nature of the emissions at this plant. So what I'm asking for is a defeat of this amendment, and offering a commitment that we look at an extension, but certainly not that long. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gingrey, nothing. The ranking member, Mr. Martin.
Strike the record. I want to ask the council or the author, the 4 plants in question, are these plants out of compliance with their permits right now for emissions? Ms. Schakowsky just talked about the amount of mercury and the dangers to pregnant women, and there's no question that mercury is a danger. But my understanding is that these plants operate within compliance of both state and federal laws in terms of emissions. Is that true or not true?
My understanding is that that's true. As they're regulated under the Clean Air Act, that they're in compliance with the regulations that apply in that context.
So if that's true, and apparently it is true, there's no state or federal regulatory agency would let these plants operate if they emitted at a level that was dangerous for public health in their community. Again, we're outlawing a process. Now, if Mrs. Schakowsky wants to just do an outright immediate ban on mercury, let's introduce that bill and have that debate. What Mr. Radonovich is saying is, let's give the communities and the companies that have this process time to transition, save those jobs in the community, go into compliance with what the Europeans are doing, and since we're not violating existing emission limits at the state or federal level for mercury, that would seem to me to make a win-win situation. Now, if on the other hand we have a health situation locally at these 4 plants that they need to be closed because of an immediate health threat, that's a different issue. But apparently that's not that is not what the reason that we're stated for moving this bill.
Would the gentleman
I'd
yield?
be happy to yield.
Thank you. The enforcement mechanism at the Environmental Protection Agency and the standards, the Toxic Substance Control Act, has meant we aren't even able to really control asbestos right now. And because we're dealing now with just a handful of plants that emit this toxic substance, mercury, which is, as everyone will agree, is highly toxic, that for us to say that dealing with the specifics, that dealing with these 4 plants will increase the health of the people in those communities and will remove a serious danger. Now, you know, there may be other times when we want to go back and look at the Environmental Protection Agency and how it does with all these various toxic substances. But in order to get to what is a pretty immediate problem, although we're willing to talk about different timelines, I think that this is the best way to go to protect those communities.
We're claiming my time, and I respect the gentlelady from Illinois and don't doubt her sincerity. But with all due respect, under existing law, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, if he or she thinks that there's a threat to public health, they have authority to set a standard for mercury right now, a bright line standard, regardless of cost, regardless of anything. If they believe there's an imminent danger to health. And I mean, I understand the sensitivity to mercury. What I don't understand is to outlaw a process apparently because only 4 plants still use it. It's just like this is some sort of a trophy to put on the wall to show that we're getting tough, but you're getting tough on the constituents of Mr. Barrow and Mr. Space and other members of the committee. I mean, the Radonovich Amendment simply says let's give these companies and their workers time to develop a new technology or to transist. 2020 is not that far away. And again, if there's a public health threat that's immediate, there's existing law that we can deal with that ASAP, and if we need to shut these plants down for that reason, let's have that debate and let's do it. But let's don't do this kind of surreptitious way that this bill would cause to occur if it were to become law. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Support the Radonovich.
The gentleman's time has expired. Does the gentlelady seek additional time?
If I could have just 1 more minute, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes himself to move to strike the last word, and recognizes himself for 5 minutes, and recognize the chairman. I mean the subcommittee vice chairman for 1 minute to yield 5 minutes. 1 minute to the chairman of the subcommittee.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that actually the Toxic Substance Control Act that prevents the notion of kind of lickety-split dealing with a problem in the community. It's very burdensome, and we may need to go look at how we can change that so that we can remove these toxins from the environment. So there really is not right now a mechanism for us to deal with relative dispatch with this known toxin. And when you say the burdensome to the people in the community, there are those in the community who would argue that the continued emission of this mercury is far more burdensome to them, that 9,000 pounds between now and 2020, a lot of children could really suffer in those communities. So we're trying to weigh that carefully.
The chair reclaims this time. For what purposes did the gentleman, Dr. Gingrey...
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word.
Dr. Gingrey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I'm encouraged by the remarks made just a few minutes ago by the author of the bill, my good friend Jan Schakowsky, in regard to having an open mind regarding the date of enactment. I know she's opposed to the 2020 date, which the European Union has essentially adopted, as Mr. Radonovich pointed out in his amendment. I'm very much in favor of his amendment, but I'm encouraged to know that the author of the bill is open to consideration. I think that suggests, Mr. Chairman, that both she and yourself have listened to the concerns expressed by the lady from Ohio, the gentleman from Ohio, the gentleman from Georgia, the ranking member of the overall committee, and myself, that we don't want to enact such a stringent requirement that you literally force these four companies to shut down, to shutter, because there's no way that they can meet these requirements within 2 years and switch over. Now, I want to say one thing, and then I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. I'm a physician member. I know where the gentle lady's heart is in regard to this bill and concern for children and mercury poison and things that can occur neurologically if they get too much mercury in their system. But little amounts of mercury, trace amounts of mercury, are not harmful at all. And I don't know.
Question, just a brief question.
I'll be glad to yield to the gentleman from North Carolina.
These emissions that we're talking about, are they into the atmosphere or into the ground?
Well, these emissions are into the atmosphere. They could be into the ground. They do dissolve in water. They get into the water, and of course the fish get this mercury, and the consumption of fish that are heavily laden with mercury is where most of this problem is. Reclaiming my time, but I would like to. Maybe council knows the answer to this question. 9,000 pounds of additional mercury output into the environment over a 10 or 11 year period when we get to 2020. What is the denominator? If 9,000 is the numerator, what is the denominator in regard to the total amount of mercury that's released by all other sources that we're not dealing with here in this particular piece of legislation? Can someone answer that question for me, General Counsel or the author?
No, well, let me, to get to what I think is the nub of the problem, these plants are estimated to release about 700 pounds of mercury each year. And since it takes only a teaspoon of mercury to contaminate an entire 20-acre lake, these amounts pose a serious risk to human health and the environment. So, in fact, it really is very small amounts. And actually, we misspoke before. The plant in West Virginia, PPG, actually is out of compliance. The state just sued them for mercury violations of water permit. So it is not true that they're all in compliance, and it is true that a tiny amount can be very toxic and a risk to human health.
Well, reclaiming my time, I've been told by our side that it's 0.1% of all global production or release of mercury in the environment. That's what we're talking about here, 0.1%. And gentle lady was just talking about how much release. I mean, if you released all 9,000 pounds and it all went into a half-acre lake that maybe the local people fished in and the children happened to get that in their diet, sure, it could cause a problem. But I mean, I think you have to look at the overall picture here and put things in perspective. So I'll yield back and just say I fully support the amendment, and I hope the gentle lady will follow through if the amendment fails, and as we work through in the full committee, maybe reach a compromise in regard to the date certain, because 2 years is impossible for these companies to stay in business. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Is there any other member who seeks recognition? The question now is on the amendment by Mr. Radonovich to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All members in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is defeated.
Mr. Chairman, on that I ask for a recorded vote.
The request for a recorded vote is ordered. Please call the roll.
Mr. Rush. Ms. Rush votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Space. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Gett. Mr. Gett votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono-Mack. Ms. Bono-Mack votes aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Ms. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes aye. Where is he?
Have all members been recorded?
Sorry, I apologize. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space votes no.
Have all members been recorded? The clerk will give us the result.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 11 and the nays were 13. I'm sorry, 14. Can't read my writing. Yes. 11 ayes, 14 noes.
In the opinion of the chairs, the amendment rather, is defeated. Does any other member seek recognition to speak on, does any other member seek to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Dr. Gingrey?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
They will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Gingrey. Page 4, strike line 24 and all that follows down through line 9 on page 5.
The amendment has been distributed, and without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize for 5 minutes Dr. Gingrey to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I ask unanimous consent to submit my remarks for the record, and I'll try to paraphrase the amendment. Mr. Chairman, during the 110th Congress, President Bush signed into law the Mercury Export Ban Act of 2008 that was introduced by then Senator Barack Obama, now President Obama, of course, and it received the overwhelming support of this committee. This bipartisan legislation specifically banned the export of elemental mercury from any company starting in the year 2013. Mr. Chairman, this law, the Mercury Export Ban Act of 2008, 8 months ago, I think it was signed into law, it bans the export of elemental mercury from all sources, not just these chlor-alkali facilities, bans it by January the 1st, 2013, and additionally requires the Department of Energy to have a facility in place by the same date to provide long-term management and storage for the mercury that may no longer be exported. In the other amendments, Mr. Chairman, my colleagues, as we talked about what could happen to a company and what's likely to happen to these 4 companies that in no way are going to be able to switch over to an entirely different manufacturing process, engineering, equipment, licensing, et cetera. It's going to take them several years, and it's most likely that these companies will just simply fold up their tent. And if they do go bankrupt, we will have neighborhoods with what? Unguarded and abandoned mercury on site, because immediately they would be prohibited from shipping any mercury, from exporting any mercury. And I think that is not exactly what we want to have. It's hardly a good public health outcome, especially if children are going to be jumping the fence and playing in these facilities, vandals mishandling the mercury. So my amendment basically says this. It would simply line up the export ban on elemental mercury with existing law that was put forward by then Senator Obama and signed into law by President Bush during the 110th Congress. It would just simply allow these companies, if they do shutter, as likely they will, then at least we don't have a toxic waste site that we've got to deal with, that they can export this mercury, and certainly they can export it in situations where there should be an exemption where there's no other source and a foreign source needs that mercury. So basically this is what the amendment says. It just puts us in alignment with current law, the legislation that was introduced by President Obama just 8 months ago and signed into law. I hope that all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle could support this common sense amendment. I'd be glad to answer any questions, but at this point, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back my time.
For what purposes does the gentlelady from Illinois seek recognition?
I'd like to speak against the amendment.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The overall legislation is looking to set a date where this mercury is no longer produced. We're concerned that upon enactment of this bill now, that these companies are likely to dump their mercury stockpiles on the international market, where there is little, if any, regulation of the way that that the toxin is handled. And it seems to me that what we want to do is set a date where sooner than 2013, where this product cannot be can't be manufactured anymore, can't be used anymore, and we want to discourage the spread of mercury around the world. So what we've said is that yes, until the product is banned, that it can be stored on site, but we do not want the United States of America to be exporters of mercury. They will have a greater incentive than anyone to now dump their stockpiles on the market. We don't want to be in the business of encouraging that. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back to the balance of her time. Is there any other member who seeks recognition?
Just a question for council.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Just a question. Isn't there, as I understand it, the Department of Energy is building a facility to store this? Is that true?
The Department of Energy is in the process of designating a facility for long-term storage that would have to be in effect and available for use by 2013.
Okay, so then if that's true, then what the gentleman, Ms. Schakowsky, said that there's no place for it after 2013.
No.
Okay, I misunderstand. Because after that, after 2013, they could store it all there, couldn't they?
Certainly after 2013, the Department of Energy designated facility should be available for storage of mercury, yes.
Okay. So why would you be against this again? I'll yield my time.
Well, what we're saying is we're going to set a deadline beyond which the mercury is not going to be accumulating. And so we don't want to create an incentive now. In the meantime, they could stockpile it on site, change their manufacturing process, and then after 2013, they could store it in this permanent facility. We don't want to create an incentive right now for them to be dumping their stockpiles on the market.
So
we want to encourage the storage until the final date and to stop the manufacture of
so you're saying, you're reclaiming my time, you're worried about between now and 2013 that they'll sell this overseas or use it because the stockpiling facility is not available, that these people will unilaterally start to get rid of it illegally, and that's what you're concerned about rather than continuing? I mean, I would think most of these suppliers, knowing that this stockpile is going to be ready at 2013, would hold it all in reserves and turn it into there. And so I don't think there'd been any reason for them to do what you say, which would be selling it overseas or selling it illegally. So, I support the gentleman's amendment. I think it's reasonable. In fact, that our president, former senator, offered this and supported it. I think it was reasonable that we should support it too, and I'm surprised the chairman hasn't accepted this amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Okay. If these companies close and leave the mercury behind, then that would be in fact illegal under current law. They're permitted now to store the mercury legally at existing permitted storage facilities, which they could do safely and securely. If the minority thinks that more storage options are necessary, we could certainly discuss that as we move forward.
Well, just in closing, there's abandoned super sites all around this country. I don't know if that's, your exception is not necessarily going to make the rule because super sites everywhere abandoned. But my point is that I think most of the people understand we'll have the super site in place by 2013, and I think the gentleman's amendment, in light of what passed by unanimous consent in the past, and I think you folks should consider this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Does any other member seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Terry, for what purposes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and just an observation, because I've seen this in Omaha. If they close down the operations, what they do is keep a security guard there, and then there's no movement of the toxic materials. They may wait a while until they have a facility to move it, but they'll keep that security guard and technically keep it open. They just won't operate it, and that's how they do it. It's what ASARCO did to Omaha for about 10 years. At this time, I'll yield my time to the good doctor from Georgia, Gingrey.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I'll use some of that time to ask counsel a question. Under the Toxic Substance Control Act, Section 12C4, it allows an exemption for, quote, essential uses, unquote, of elemental mercury based on several factors. Does the amendment in the nature of a substitute still allow these plants help meet essential mercury needs in other parts of the world, or would they be prohibited from doing that by virtue of this bill?
Those exemptions contained in Section 12 of TSCA do not apply to the export ban contained in this bill. No.
Let me make sure I understand your response. So, if we do not adopt this amendment, and the amendment in the nature of substitute is a final passage, then these 4 plants would not be able immediately upon passage of this bill. They would not be able to export mercury, and nor would they be able to export it if there was an essential use. All provisions met for an essential use, they would be prohibited still from doing that.
Essentially, that's correct. That the essential use exemption does not apply.
Yeah, reclaiming my time, and that is the whole point and my concern here. That as Mr. Terry was talking about, you know, if these plants are going to continue to remain in operation, if they're given enough time, they would. And hopefully Ms. Schakowsky will reconsider the Radonovich amendment as we get to the full committee. They would have a 24/7 operation. It would be probably a safe thing to do to have on-site storage. But once these plants close down and shutter, and they will, you might have one guard there, particularly on the midnight to 7 a.m. shift. But you're talking about an essential, a likely Superfund site in a very dangerous situation. So here again, to stop these companies from exporting their mercury offshore, I think I can understand the gentlewoman's intent, but I think the result of that is going to be just the opposite of what she wants. I think
would the gentleman yield on that point?
And I'll be glad to yield.
Yeah, I think we can all stipulate, because you referred to the legislation we passed, we could all stipulate that it's dangerous stuff. We don't want it to be exported. What the date is the subject of your amendment. We don't want it to be exported. I think what the gentlelady is trying to argue here is that we don't want to create a dynamic that has them shunt the problem to someone else. We already as a Congress have spoken loudly. We don't want this to be shipped overseas. So the only question then is how quickly you stop that, and whether we don't want to create an incentive with this legislation to us sending this somewhere else.
Well, reclaiming my time, Mr. Weiner, and actually it's not my time. It's my colleague's time from Nebraska. But the fact that again, to also say that you can't ship it, even if there's an essential use, an essential need that meets all the provisions of current law.
Would the gentleman just briefly
makes no sense, and so I think that this amendment is a very common sense compromise, and I would hope that all my colleagues could support this, and then the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended could go forward to the full committee.
Would the gentleman yield? For the gentleman,
I yield back my time to Mr. Terry.
Okay, just to know that the majority talked to the minority about extending that, what do we call it, the essential use exemption, and that was turned down. Just to know.
The gentleman's time is concluded, and he's got about 5 seconds to go. All right. Gentlemen, you're back there. Thank you, gentlemen. Does any other member seek recognition? The question is now on the amendment by Dr. Gingrich to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All members in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is defeated.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rush?
No.
Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Schakowsky? No. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Stupak? No. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Green? Mr. Gonzalez? No. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Weiner? No. Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Butterfield? No. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Barrow? No. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui? No. Ms. Matsui, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Space? No. Mr. Space votes no. Mr. Braley? No. Mr. Braley votes no. Ms. DeGette? No. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Radonovich?
Aye.
Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Stearns?
Aye.
Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Whitfield?
Aye.
Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Pitts?
Aye.
Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bonomack? Aye. Ms. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Terry? Aye. Mr. Terry, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania?
Aye.
Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gingrey? Aye. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Aye. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Barton? Aye. Mr. Barton, aye.
Mr. Madison,
Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. Mr. Matheson is not recorded. Okay. Mr. Matheson votes no.
are there any other members who? Okay. Will the clerk announce the?
Yes, sir.
result?
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 10 ayes and 16 noes.
The noes have it, the amendment is defeated. Does any other member seek to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of, Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. A, renumber subsection B.
I'm going to ask that the amendment be considered read.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Murphy, I recognize you for 5 minutes to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment allows for some companies to transition under this ban, and that is that recognizing it will take them several years to rebuild a plant. Estimates are it could take $100 million to put in the investments to change over from a mercury process. This would allow plants to ask for an extension if necessary of 5 years, and then if they run into some other bureaucratic problems along the way, they could ask for a waiver and extension of up to 4 more years. Along these lines, I'd like to mention a letter I received from PPG Industries, a Pittsburgh company, and they noted that the chlor-alkali industry provides critical benefits to society and is essential to the U.S. economy. Chlorine is a key building block in thousands of products, including pharmaceuticals, plastic, computer and vehicular components, fiber optic cable, energy-efficient building materials, renewable energy resources like solar panels, as well as fire-resistant materials for law enforcement, emergency response, and military applications. And of course, we know that chlorine is used to disinfect drinking water, and it's actually a requirement in drinking water systems. The chlor-alkali industry directly contributes over $7 billion to the North American economy. In 2007 and 2008, the chlor-alkali industry played an active role in publicly advocating for legislation that bans the export of mercury by January 2013 and establishes a government facility to permanently store surplus mercury in an environmentally sound manner. That, of course, is worked out through several organizations and stakeholders. This chlor-alkali industry notes that the ban discriminates against mercury as used in our industry, even though the mercury is identical to mercury from other sources. They go on to state that they're concerned that it will take much longer than 2 years to construct any building or process that would require a change in this. The cost of such a conversion at an individual site is likely in excess of $100 million and may be significantly greater for a large site. We know that there's 4 sites in the United States right now: Tennessee, Ohio, West Virginia, and Georgia. And the concern is that with these plants, it would be virtually impossible for them to meet the standards set forth in this act. And therefore, although we're all concerned about making sure we reduce mercury and eliminate where we can, given that Europe is also seeing a 30 to 50% drop in their chemical industries, and Asia, particularly China, is investing massive amounts of money to build their plants to do this, I think inevitably what would come up is that these factories would send these jobs offshore to China, not necessarily make any change in mercury in our planet, and we would have lost a lot of jobs and not had an advance. So that is the basis of this amendment, Mr. Chairman, and with that I yield back.
Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Murphy, I appreciate your concerns about the feasibility of the timetables in the bill and the financing for these plants. Both Ms. Schakowsky and myself are sympathetic to these concerns, and we would like to work with you to find a reasonable solution to these issues. And we look forward to working with you and other members of the committee between now and the full committee, and it's my understanding that you will withdraw your amendment based on those.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate the opportunity. I know a number of members on both sides of the aisle are deeply concerned with how to resolve this issue, and I'm sure I speak for all of us that we look forward to that opportunity to work with you and the ranking member on resolving this issue.
Thank you very much. You withdraw your amendment.
And with that, I'll ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
So does any other member seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I seek recognition to offer and withdraw an amendment.
The ranking member, Mr. Radonovich, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's described as Radonovich 2, I think, at the desk. And in light of the discussion we've had in this markup, I wanted to bring to people's attention that this is just a partial list of all the restrictions and regulations that control the, pardon me? Oh, I'm sorry.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Radonovich. Page 4, strike line 20 through 23 and insert.
The amendment has been distributed without objection. The amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Radonovich is recognized for 5 minutes to explain this amendment.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I was mentioning earlier, this is a list, just a partial list of the regulations that affect the chlor-alkali industry. It's a long list. And given that, and also current information that was released by the U.S. Geological Survey, the Department of Interior and the EPA, that is a landmark geological survey study demonstrating how methylmercury, which is known to contaminate seafood, which is where most of the mercury poisoning originates from, this methylmercury by and large originates in the oceans. And these 2 points plus this third point, that the underlying bill essentially eliminates a manufacturing process that emits a smaller amount of mercury in producing chlorine and caustic soda when compared to other industries. In fact, in 2005, the EP ranked this industry sixth on the list of industries that use mercury. What has happened to the number of those numbers between 1 and 5? These industries that, power plant emissions, for example, release 52.6 tons of annual emissions. Hazardous waste incinerators release 16.4 tons of annual emissions. Electric arc furnaces release 7.4 tons annually of mercury emissions. Gold mining, 2.4 tons in annual emissions. Municipal solid waste combustion, which are incinerators, release 2.4 tons of annual emissions. And the chlor-alkali or mercury cell chlorine facilities release 1.1 tons of annual emissions. If this is about protecting health, and we are going to go out of our way to eliminate an entire manufacturing process that only ranks sixth on a list of mercury producers, perhaps this committee should look at the rest of the industries. And my amendment says that any manufacturing, processing, distribution, use, or disposal that involves some form of elemental mercury shall be prohibited if it presents an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment. And I would like to ask the author of a bill, whom I have great respect for, why are we only focusing on this one industry, the sixth worst emitter, when there are 5 other industries that emit far more mercury, the coal industry being the worst?
The gentleman want to yield to the...
And I'd yield to the gentlelady for an answer.
Well, essentially what you're saying is that you just send this to the this whole area to the Environmental Protection Agency, where we know that the Toxic Substances Control Act has a very long, cumbersome process that is unlikely actually to address this issue. We have in our hands right now an opportunity, and some of the numbers that were quoted before about the amount of emissions were old numbers, to make a significant reduction. That is not to say that we shouldn't at some other time address other sources and other ways that mercury can get into the environment, but this is an opportunity right now to address this. It's what is it, about 2.5% of the mercury emissions, which is significant given what a toxic substance it is. Your suggestion kicks it down the road, and I see that really is not an effort to move on this issue, but rather at this point to delay on it. But, having said that, I want to say that going forward, I hope that we can continue to work together. Despite the back and forth today, I think at the end of the day, the product that comes out of this subcommittee will be one that we've worked through jointly with you and with all of the stakeholders, and I look forward to doing that.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady from Illinois, and I want to say, that this is, I think that when you're looking at the risk and loss of American jobs, I think that you need to put the risk in perspective, and that's what I'm trying to do with this piece of legislation. When over, if I can tally up quickly, it looks like 70 tons annually of mercury emissions in the air are happening every year, and we're only looking at a bill that deals with 1.1, and it takes that unprecedented step of outlawing a process and killing American jobs when the evidence shows that most of the mercury poisoning originates in the oceans. I think we need to keep it all into perspective, especially when we're looking at the difference of outlawing the process immediately or extending it up to to be equal with EU standards for the year 2020. And that's the purpose of my amendment is to try to put all this in risk. I'm trying to save American jobs. We want to do that. This is a job killer for the United States, and we need to be aware that it may not have any bearing or effect for the purpose for which the amendment was, or the bill was generated. So having made that point, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and withdraw my amendment.
Does any other member seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I won't take 5 minutes. I just strike the last word just to say, you know, in fact, for all the talk about how unprecedented this is, we do this type of thing all the time. We discover that a common practice is harmful, and we move to ban it. We did a similar thing with asbestos. We discovered that the way that we were protecting children in movie theaters from fires was to weaving into garments, weaving into curtains. We weaved asbestos. We found out that it was harmful. We said we could stop it at some point, and in fact, what the federal government did is it kept secret a lot of the information that we had. It went on for a better part of a half generation. We were installing it in ships and boats, and a lot of people died because of it. And I think that what the gentlelady is trying to do is trying to be mindful of the notion that there is a livelihood at stake here, but there's a higher imperative sometimes. And I think that you could always say, well, you know what, we've got people working on in these factories that are producing this dangerous thing, but whether it's 2% or 22%, it's not uncommon for the Energy and Commerce Committee to come across something that's going on in the world of interstate commerce, say that's dangerous, we're going to try to undo it. So I think that I would share the gentlelady's desire that we work on this in a bipartisan way, and I think that my Republican friends just as much want to prevent people from being harmed by products as we do, and it's just a matter of trying to get as expeditiously as possible a dangerous product out of the bloodstream of the nation's economy. And I'll yield the balance of my time to the gentlelady from Illinois.
And I just wanted to say that my hope is that, again, at the end of the day, if we work out the time period, that we're not talking about inevitable job loss here, that we're talking about a phasing out that, as other manufacturing plants have done, and hopefully we'll not see the inevitable loss of those jobs.
Mr. Chairman.
Chair, for what purposes does the ranking member of the full committee?
Strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
First, Mr. Chairman, I think we're about to finish the markup, so before I say some somewhat uncomplimentary things, let me say some complimentary things. The fact that we're having a markup at subcommittee is commendable for you and Ms. Schakowsky and the other authors of the bills. It is better to mark up at subcommittee. You get more issues on the table. Even if the amendments are disagreed with, we at least flesh out what the inflection points are. And so the end result at full committee will be a better product because of you working with Mr. Radonovich and other members on our side with members on your side. So I do want to sincerely compliment you and Mr. Radonovich for putting this markup together. And I mean that sincerely. Now let me say some things about the base bill that's under consideration with regard to asbestos, because several members on the majority have talked about asbestos. I could take you to an empty factory in Congressman Chet Edwards' district outside of Hillsborough, Texas, that when I was a young congressman was in my congressional district and employed 350 people. They were the highest paid workers in the county. Hill County had a population of about 25,000. This plant had been there for approximately 20 years. It made concrete pipe that was primarily exported overseas to Africa for water projects. And it used asbestos as an insulator and a strengthener in the pipe, okay? There was never, ever recorded an incident where the asbestos in that pipe caused harm. There were numerous projects in Africa that brought clean water to rural Africa that saved lives, that cleaned up areas that were susceptible to malaria. But when the U.S. Congress and the U.S. government outlawed asbestos, because they're in the manufacturing, the asbestosis in the manufacturing could get into the lungs and did, and was a very dangerous substance. But instead of trying to do something to make it safer, we just banned that product. That plant closed down. It's vacant to this day. How many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people have died because of drought or malnutrition or malaria because they didn't have the economical pipe that could bring fresh, clean water to their communities? Who knows? What happened to those workers in Hillsborough, Texas? Who knows? But that plant's gone. That plant's gone. And we're here today to mark a bill up that, if it becomes law, is a death sentence to somewhere between 400 and 1,000 people in terms of their jobs, not to themselves personally, obviously, but for their jobs. Now, that's not a lot of jobs. You know, the climate change bill is probably going to cost 3 million jobs a year when it's implemented for the first year. But 1,000 jobs, if they're in your district, if that's your job, it's real. And the only reason I can see why we picked on these 4 plants is because they're just not that many people. It's not the biggest mercury producer, as Mr. Radonovich has pointed out. And no matter how you cut it, it's not percentage. It's not the top of the percentage. It's not the top of the non-compliance. It's just 400 to 800 jobs, and we can do it, and we're going to do it. Now, Mrs. Schakowsky has said that she's going to work between now and full committee with Mr. Radonovich and Mr. Gingrey and Mr. Murphy and others to perfect the bill and extend the time, and I hope she does. But it's not a good precedent for us to just begin to cavalierly decide that, you know, if there's some politically incorrect industry out there, that we can just go after them and put them out of business because there might be some potential down the road negative impact.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to yield.
I imagine I'm not interpreting it right, but I don't think there's any doubt that asbestos and banning the use of asbestos was a wise thing from a public health perspective. And I hope that you are right, that was the rare factory and the rare plant where cases of asbestos-related diseases did not emerge. I say I hope because neither you and I know, because as you know, the gestation period can be 10, 20, or 30 years, like it was for my grandfather, who worked for years in the Navy Yards being told that there's no real safety problem here, and it wasn't until after he died that we found out that in fact he was, day by day, year by year, breathing a substance that we knew was unsafe, and we allowed it to keep happening.
Look, reclaiming my time, which is
this happens from time to time, and I think I understand your point, but I don't think anyone should leave on the record the notion that banning asbestos was somehow a mistake, or it was a politically correct thing to do. It was a thing to save people's lives, and unfortunately we did it too late.
Reclaiming my time, which is expired, let me simply say, I never have denied that asbestosis and asbestos, when it gets into the body and gets into the lung, is a serious, serious health problem. I will say in the instance of this plant, there was never an instance at that plant of a worker coming down with asbestosis. There was never an instance of the product that was produced at that plant being linked to any claims of asbestosis in the areas that product was used. And I do think that had we not had a complete ban, there could have been alternatives developed that that allowed asbestos to be used in certain conditions and in a manufacturing process that would not have developed the problem that your grandfather had. So My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. You've been very gracious. I just hope that this subcommittee, as we go to full committee, will take some of these issues under advisement. But again, thank you for holding the markup. It has been productive.
Does any other members seek recognition? If not, there being no further discussion, the question is on the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. I now move that the subcommittee report H.R. 2190 as amendment to the full committee with a recommendation that the bill pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 2190 to the Committee on Commerce, Energy and Commerce. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 2190 is ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I do ask for a recorded vote as well.
The ranking members ask for a recorded vote. The clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Rush?
No.
Mr. Rush?
Aye, I'm sorry, aye.
Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush votes aye.
Aye, aye, aye.
Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak votes aye.
Okay,
Mr. Green? Mr. Gonzalez?
Okay.
Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson?
Is it 7:30 or 7?
Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Space? Mr. Space votes aye. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley, aye. Ms. DeGette?
All right, man. You all right?
Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes aye.
Right, yeah.
Mr. Waxman?
Well, tomorrow you up.
Mr. Radonovich?
No.
Mr. Radonovich votes no. Mr. Stearns? No. Mr. Stearns votes no. Mr. Whitfield? No. Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Pitts? No. Mr. Pitts votes no. Ms. Bonomack? No. Ms. Bonomack, no. Mr. Terry? No. Mr. Terry, no. Mrs. Myrick?
Thank you.
Mr. Sullivan?
Appreciate you. Thank you. Okay, okay.
Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? No. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gingrey? No. Mr. Gingrey, no.
Yes.
Mr. Scalise?
Yes.
Mr. Scalise, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes no.
All members voted who desire to be voted, to vote rather. All right, will the clerk please report the results?
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 16 ayes and 10 noes.
The ayes have it. The bill is passed and reported to the full committee for passage. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming corrections without objections. So ordered. The markup, the subcommittee markup is now adjourned. I want to thank the staff for its excellent work and outstanding and hard work. Thank you so very much to the staff. And the subcommittee now stands adjourned.